Tonight, I'm going to tell you a very famous story from Thailand. This story was recommended to me by a fan, actually, and I had never heard of it before. But the second I started looking into this, I knew that I had to tell this one, and not just tell it, I had to tell it sitting in front of a campfire. And you'll see why. This is like classic, scary campfire storytelling. But before we get into tonight's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right campfire, because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times a week. So if that's of interest to you, the next time that you and the follow button are around a campfire together, offer them some nice hot coffee. But don't tell them you've put hot sauce in it. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into tonight's story. One morning in the early 1850s, a young man named Mok rowed a small boat through a canal in Prakanong, Thailand, which is a very rural community southeast of Bangkok. And Mok was rowing as fast as he possibly could, because where he was going was home and he could not wait to get there. So Mok had been away for almost an entire year by this point. And that was because around a year ago, he'd been drafted into the Thai military and forced to go fight in a war against the neighboring country of Burma. And for Mok, getting drafted had really come at like the absolute worst possible time. Because at the time, his wife, May Nok, had been just a couple of months pregnant with their first child. And so he had to just, basically leave her behind to give birth on her own, which was obviously really difficult for her and for him. Like, he wanted to be there for her and he couldn't. And also, this is 1850s in rural Thailand. So once he was gone, there were no phones or really any way to send letters back and forth. So really, ever since Mok had left, he'd had literally zero communication with his wife. So he has no idea how she's doing, how the baby's doing, nothing. And, he's off fighting in a war. And in fact, he actually got hurt while he was fighting and had to spend months in a military hospital recovering. But his wife had no idea. So Mok rowed even faster, and finally, he saw his home in the distance. It was a wooden house that stood on tall stilts right on the edge of the canal with a large balcony that overlooked the water, and it was surrounded by lime trees and thick forest, and it was at least a mile away from the nearest neighbors. So it's a pretty secluded place, but it was a place he desperately missed. As Mok neared the small dock in front of his house, he began excitedly calling out for his wife. And as he did, he began tying up the boat, expecting at any moment to see his wife come running outside with the baby. But his wife didn't. She didn't call back. She didn't come out. It was just quiet. And for a moment, Mok had this horrible thought that maybe something had happened to her while he was gone. Like, how would he know? But then he heard the door open, and out came his wife with a big grin on her face, and she was clutching their baby against her chest. She began calling out to him, and Mok saw there were tears of joy streaming down her face, and he leapt out of the boat and he ran to her. A few days later, Mok woke up inside of his home, and he rolled over in bed and saw his wife still asleep, and he also saw their baby sleeping in a small hammock right beside the bed. And as Mok looked at his little family, he felt almost deliriously happy. I mean, ever since he had gotten home, it was like Mok had entered this just perfect life, like just utter domestic bliss. His baby would turn out to be a boy, which he was really excited about because he had sort of secretly wanted a son. And, over the last couple of days, he had had a chance to basically tell his wife all of his crazy war stories. And she had listened really intently, and she also had gone out of her way to cook him all his favorite meals. And so he was just so grateful to be back here that he literally had not left their home at all since he got back. He just stayed home and just enjoyed this unbelievable homecoming. But on this particular morning, Mok knew he would have to leave because he had to go to the market because their kitchen was basically empty, so they needed food. And so Mok, he climbed out of bed, and as quietly as he could, he got dressed, trying hard not to wake up the baby or his wife. And then when he was ready to actually leave, he walked over to his wife and he gently leaned down and just told her that, hey, I'm going to leave now, I'll be back soon. Now, Mok didn't really expect much of a reaction from his wife. He figured she would just sort of say, okay, see you soon, but no. As soon as she heard he was leaving, it's like her eyes opened wide and she almost looked panicked. And she sat up in bed and she grabbed Mock's arm and she actually shouted, "No!" And in fact, she said it so loudly that she woke up their baby. And so the baby's crying, and Mock, at first, he just stared at his wife in total confusion. Like, what is she doing here? And then he said, what's going on? Why do you care so much if I leave? Like, what's wrong? And May Knock, his wife, still clutching his arm, she just kept shaking her head saying, "No, you can't leave." And then she looked away like she was trying to find the words or something. And then finally she looked back at him, and it was clear she had sort of calmed down a little bit. And she said to him that, you've been gone for so long, she just didn't want him to leave again. She said what she wanted him to do was just stay home right here. Don't leave her, don't leave their son, please. Something bad's going to happen if you leave. You've got to stay here. And when Mock heard this, it was actually kind of touching. The idea that his wife was, so protective of him that she didn't want him to leave. He liked that. But, he smiled and he told her, yeah, but somebody has to go get food here. So I'm going to go, I'm going to get us food. I'll be back, in a few minutes. This is not a big deal. And then he gave his wife a hug and a kiss. And she's looking at him like, "Don't you do this." But he said, "Look, I'll be back as soon as possible." And then he turned and he left. A little while later, and Mock had arrived at the fruit stand in the market. The market was in the village center, which was a few miles from his house, but he had walked here as quickly as he could because, he had promised his wife he'd be back as quickly as he could. And when Mock went to the man who owned the fruit stand to purchase, the items that he had picked out, the owner of the fruit stand looked at Mock and seemed genuinely surprised to see him. And then he gave Mock an almost sympathetic look and then asked him, "How are you doing?" Now, Mock and the fruit stand owner were not friends, but this village was so small that everybody who lived there knew everybody else. And so, an interaction like this was not unusual. Not to mention the fact that basically everybody knew Mock had gone to war, but they didn't know he had just gotten back. And so Mock assumed that what he was asking about was basically "Hey, I can see you're back from the war. How are you doing?" Mock told the owner that, the war had been terrible, but now he was finally home. He was back with his wife and his son. He's so happy to have a son. And so really, despite the war, he'd never been better. His life was perfect right now. But the owner of the fruit stand, when he heard this, he actually looked back at Mock with a pretty confused look on his face and was like, "Your wife is home?" And Mock was like, "Yeah, of course. Where else would she be?" The fruit stand owner was confused for a second and then just sort of shook his head and said, I thought I had heard something different, so I was just confused. And then sort of awkwardly, the fruit stand owner changed the subject and just said, "Okay, what do you want to buy?" Later that morning, Mock returned to his home, now carrying several bags of food. And as he approached his home from a distance, he saw his wife out on the balcony feeding their baby. But from the looks of it, his wife was just sort of staring off into space. Mock called out to her, and it kind of snapped her back to reality, and she turned to him, and she broke into this huge smile. And then she got up, and she walked off the balcony into the house, and then when Mock got inside, she found her waiting for him in the kitchen. And for the most part, she looked really happy and relieved to see him back. It was like, phew, thank goodness nothing happened to you while you were away for 20 minutes. Her panic was gone. She was happy to have him back. And Mock was happy to see her, but at the same time, he also couldn't stop thinking about that strange interaction he had had with the fruit stand owner. How he had been like, "Oh, your wife's home?" It was a question as if he knew something that he wasn't saying. And, Mock was just thinking about it. And so as he put the food away, he told his wife, what the guy had said and how odd it was. And Mock's wife, when she heard this, she got really angry. And she told Mock that this was exactly why she had worried about him leaving the house in the first place. She said that ever since he had left to go to war, people in their village had been talking about her nonstop, spreading all kinds of horrible rumors. And so Mock asked her, what kind of rumors? What are you talking about? But his wife did not elaborate. She just angrily shook her head and then stormed back out onto the balcony. A couple of days later, Mock was out in the forest that surrounded his home, chopping down trees for firewood. He and his wife had not talked any more about the situation with the owner of the fruit stand and, the rumors that people in the town were supposedly spreading about her. Mock was ultimately just sort of puzzled by his wife's behavior. Before he had left for the war, she had always been very logical and independent, and so the fact that she suddenly seemed to care so much about what other people were saying about her, and the way she never wanted Mock to leave her sight, was just odd. The only reasonable explanation Mock could come up with was that, for the last year, his wife had spent a lot of time all alone with a brand new baby and with lots of fear that her husband was never going to come home. Like, that would take a toll on you. And so his hope was that, now that he was home, that she would just, get better. So he was trying his best to just go about his life like normal. But, just that morning when he had told his wife he was going to go out and get some firewood, she had started sobbing and begging him not to go. And it had taken him like a full half an hour to calm her down and convince her to let him go because they needed the firewood. And so Mock really didn't know what to make of this. He just hoped that, in time, this would get better. And so Mock just went about his morning, chopping down trees to get some firewood. And at some point, as he was literally chopping down a tree, he heard footsteps coming from behind him. And when he turned around, he sort of half expected to see his wife, but he didn't. He was sort of surprised to see it was this elderly man in a long robe walking directly towards him. Like, clearly, this guy is coming to talk to him. Now, for a second, Mock actually didn't know who this guy was, but then he realized, based on what he was wearing, that he was a monk. And then as he got closer, he could see that it actually is someone who lived and worked at a Buddhist temple in their village. And so this was not a total stranger. In fact, this monk was more like a community leader of sorts. And so as Mock is sort of putting this together, he figured that the reason this guy was coming over was just to, welcome him home from the war. And so Mock lowered his axe and smiled and waved. But the monk didn't smile back. Instead, he walked right up next to Mock, really close to him, and he looked around the forest in sort of a paranoid way, and then in almost a whisper, he asked Mock if he was alone. Mock was definitely weirded out by this and didn't have any idea why this guy was acting this way. But, Mock said, "Yes, I am alone." At this point, the monk seemed to relax, and he told Mock that he really needed to tell him about his wife. And Mock kind of perked up, like, "What are you talking about?" And the monk said that Mock's wife had become convinced that people in their village were spreading rumors about her. And she'd begun going around town terrorizing people to get back at them. At this point, the monk leaned back and gave Mock this expectant look, like he thought maybe Mock was going to apologize for his wife's behavior or something. But to Mock, this information didn't make sense. His wife definitely had talked about people spreading rumors about her, and she was acting pretty strange and paranoid. But to Mock, this information didn't make any sense. On the one hand, his wife had, mentioned that she believed people were spreading these awful rumors about her, so Mock had heard that. But the idea that she was really doing anything about it other than being upset was just false. How could she be out terrorizing anybody when she literally was at the house with him, like all day long? She couldn't. He was with her. He would have seen it. So, as respectfully as he could, Mock told the monk that he must be confused because there was just no way his wife was acting on any of her suspicions. She might be upset about this stuff, but she's not terrorizing anyone. But the monk just shook his head and told Mock straight up that, no, you're wrong. Everyone else in the village knew there was something seriously wrong with his wife. Like, everybody knows it. You're the only one who doesn't. And before Mock could say anything else, the monk said to him, if he was smart, he would leave his wife right now and he would never look back. And when Mock heard this, he did not believe the monk. Instead, he actually realized that his wife must be telling the truth about how awful everybody was being, spreading these terrible rumors about her. Like, she wasn't being paranoid at all. She had all the reason in the world to think people were out to get her or something. So at this point, Mock dropped the polite act and just told the monk to leave him and his family alone. And then Mock gathered up the wood that he had chopped down and began heading back towards his house. But the next morning, Mock just couldn't get the conversation he had had with the monk out of his mind. Mostly he was just angry at whoever was making up these weird rumors about his wife that was causing, people like the monk and maybe the fruit stand owner to say the weird things they were saying. But also, Mock didn't know what these rumors actually were. He just knew that something was being said about his wife. It was upsetting his wife, but he didn't know what the details were. He figured if he did have the context, have the details, then he could shut the rumors down much more effectively. But he also really didn't want to bring this up to his wife again because he knew it would just really upset her. So he decided that what he needed to do was go back into the village market and go talk to that fruit stand owner. Clearly he knew more than he was letting on. So that morning, Mock got up and as quietly as he could, he snuck out of the house while his wife and son were still asleep, and he hurried off to the market. And even though it was barely dawn by the time he got there was already a bunch of people that were setting up their stands. However, when Mock made his way over to where the fruit stand had been when he had gone there a couple days earlier, he found it was empty. And for some reason that Mock just couldn't even explain, this immediately gave him a really bad feeling. So instead of waiting around to see if maybe the owner of the fruit stand showed up later, Mock decided he would just go to the guy's house since he knew where he lived. So Mock left the village center and jogged to this guy's house. It was a wooden building up on stilts, just like Mock's house, except it was further away from the canal. When Mock got there, he climbed up a ladder to the porch and then he knocked on the front door. But nobody answered. And so he knocked again, but still there was no answer. And then Mock pressed his ear to the door, but he heard nothing. It was like eerily silent. And at this point, Mock just could not shake this feeling that something was really wrong here, like with the fruit stand owner. So he just reached down and tried the doorknob, and the door swung right open. But as soon as it did, Mock smelled something absolutely rancid inside of this home. And so at this point, Mock, he covered his nose with his hand and continued yelling for the fruit stand owner and began walking slowly into the home, looking around for the guy. But there was no movement inside of the home, and he's calling out over and over again. And then eventually he notices something on the ground, and he looks down and he sees it's the fruit stand owner, and he was just covered in blood and obviously dead. Mock sprinted out of the house, he climbed down the ladder and just began running away as fast as he could. And he knew that what he should be doing is going back to the village center to tell someone about what he had just found. But Mock just couldn't bring himself to do it because he just had this gut feeling that even though he had no idea if his wife was in any way involved with this death, he just felt like based on the rumors and the weird stuff with his wife, that everybody was gonna blame her. So instead of running towards the village center, Mock just began running towards his own house. And when he got close, he slowed down, sort of caught his breath, and he hoped that it was still early enough that his wife and son would still be asleep and he could just sort of sneak back in and, figure out what to do from there, but without alerting his wife and having to explain what was going on. However, just then he was close enough to his house that he could see the balcony that overlooked the water. And he looked up and he saw his wife was clearly awake. She was out on the balcony with the baby on her hip. However, she didn't seem to notice Mock approaching. And so Mock, he's just walking slowly towards the house, thinking, how he's going to explain where he's been to his wife. He figured she's probably upset with him. He didn't know. But he's watching her, and she, again, not aware of Mock, she reaches up and she grabs a lime off a nearby lime tree that was sort of dangling over the balcony. And so she grabs the fruit and she pulls it off the tree and she drops it. She fumbles the lime, and the lime falls on the balcony and actually goes and falls between one of the slats on the floorboards. And this balcony is up on stilts, like the whole house is. And so the balcony was 7 feet off the ground. And so when the lime fell through the floorboards, it actually fell 7 feet to the ground below. And so Mock, he's watching this happen, and this is not like some meaningful event to him. He's just sort of, clocking that she's dropped this lime, and he's thinking she's gonna, grab a different lime, right? But no, he watched as his wife sort of almost robotically kneeled down and then put her arm into the slat that this lime had fallen through. Again, she still has not seen Mock yet. And he watched as her arm began to stretch away from her body, and down her arm went. It stretched nearly 7 feet until her hand grabbed the lime on the ground. And then her arm was making these horrible crackling sounds as it retracted back up through the floorboards. And then she had her lime. And it was at that point that she turned and looked at Mock. Mock, at this point, was horrified, and he just turned and ran. And this time, he went directly to the center of the village, to the Buddhist temple, where that monk had come from, the one that had basically tried to warn him about his wife. And so Mok, he begins pounding on the door of this temple, begging the monks to let him inside and to hide him from his wife. And eventually the doors open, the monks immediately let him inside, and they do hide him. And for a little while, he's just like beside himself, Mok. He like can't even process what he just saw. He's telling himself that, that couldn't have happened. Her arm couldn't have stretched that far, but like, it looks so real. He couldn't reconcile what he had just experienced. And the monks, for the most part, just kind of let Mok have his moment of just being totally upset. But then eventually, when Mok kind of calmed down, the monk who had originally come to him to warn him about his wife, he came over to Mok and he said, I got to tell you the truth about your wife. But they told Mok that in order to do that, Mok was going to have to agree to do something that was going to be incredibly painful. They would need him to allow them to exhume his beloved wife's long-dead corpse. It would turn out that what everyone in the village knew, but Mok did not know, was that his wife and son had both died during childbirth while he was away in the war. His wife's body had literally been in the ground for months, but apparently her ghost was still around and very attached to Mok and would not let anybody get between them. It was not until Mok did give the monks permission to exhume his wife's body that they could finally stop this haunting. And so the monks ultimately carved out a circular-shaped piece of her skull and performed a Buddhist ritual to trap her spirit inside the bone. Today, in Prakanong, the village where Mok and his wife and his son had lived, is now home to a permanent shrine to Mae Nok. She's seen by some as a very dangerous and terrifying ghost, and by others as a symbol of love that is so powerful it transcends death. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The Mr. Ballin Podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, Mr. Ballin. Our head of writing is Evan Allen, produced by Jeremy Bone and Cole Lacasio. This episode was written by Karis Pash Cooper. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, Camille Callahan, Alex Paul, Ben Fasciano. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Jordan Stidham. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song, Something Wicked, by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballin Podcast. And just a reminder, every new and exclusive episode we put out on the Mr. Ballin Podcast, you can also now watch on the Mr. Ballin YouTube channel that very same day. And trust me, some of these stories you truly have to see to believe. Again, my YouTube channel is just called Mr. Ballin. If you want to listen to episodes 1 week early and ad-free, you can subscribe to SiriusXM Podcast Plus on Apple Podcasts or visit SiriusXM.com/Podcast Plus to listen with Spotify or another app of your choice. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. On a spring night in 2009, a woman was walking through a busy Target parking lot, carrying a few things she'd just bought to her car. Suddenly, the woman heard a loud bang of a gunshot echo through the parking lot, and she heard other people screaming and running for cover. But amidst all this chaos, the woman actually turned to where she thought the sound had come from, and she saw this strange-looking man with a big mustache and wild black hair calmly walking away from a parked SUV. And then a moment later, she saw him walk out of the lot and into the surrounding woods, where he disappeared. Soon, police would launch a county-wide search to try to track this man down, not realizing he was hiding in plain sight the whole time. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the Strange, Dark, and Mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, please invite the follow button shopping with you, and when you're inside of a very fancy store, secretly stick a magnetic alarm sticker onto their back and then leave. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the morning of Sunday, April 26, 2009, in a suburb of Atlanta, Georgia, a 25-year-old woman named Heather Strube sat with her boyfriend, Mike, at the kitchen table of Mike's home. Heather and Mike had been dating for a year, but somehow everything still felt fresh and new, and Heather wished she could just spend all day with Mike. But this Sunday, Heather had plans. She was going to church, then to do some chores at her house, and then she would pick up her 19-month-old son from his father. She knew, in theory, she could skip church in order to spend a little more time with Mike. But for Heather, skipping church was like missing a meal. Whenever she did it, she ended up with an empty feeling in her stomach. So, after taking her last bite, Heather stood up and dropped her dishes in the sink, kissed Mike on the forehead, told him she loved him, and walked out the door. Heather drove across town to church, went inside, sat down in a long wooden pew, and waited for the service to start. Church had always been an important part of Heather's life. In fact, she was convinced that if it wasn't for church, she never would have been born, because Heather's parents had first met and fallen in love at a Presbyterian church camp. That was why, when Heather was a teenager, it had felt like fate when she went to youth group and fell in love with a young classmate named Stephen Strube. Heather and Stephen had connected right away. They dated for several years and always talked about their future together. And then in May of 2004, they got married. At first, life had been good for the young couple. Heather and her parents opened a flower shop, and Heather worked there every day. She had always loved flowers, and being around them just made her happy. And the flower shop was a true family business. Stephen would often come by to help out at the shop, and his mother, Joanna, she would even pitch in when things got really busy. And in September of 2007, the family grew when Heather and Stephen had a baby boy. They named him Carson, and Heather felt like God had truly blessed her and her family. But now, sitting in church, Heather did not feel so blessed anymore. She was vaguely aware that the preacher had started the service, but she was barely listening. She was only thinking about Carson. Heather had not seen her son all weekend, and she hated the days when she wasn't with him. And she blamed her now soon-to-be ex-husband, Stephen, for keeping them apart. Heather and Stephen's happy life had fallen apart just months after Carson was born. One day at the flower shop, Stephen's mom, Joanna, had come across a receipt for some jewelry that Stephen had bought. Joanna figured the jewelry had been a gift for Heather, and she thought Heather might want the receipt to keep track of the family finances. But when Heather looked at the receipt, she'd been really confused. She didn't recognize the jewelry that was listed on the receipt. Stephen had never given her anything like that. And that's when she realized Stephen must be cheating on her, and he had bought this jewelry for some other woman. And when she confronted him about it, Stephen admitted to everything. Heather had at least wanted to try to make the marriage work, but Stephen told her he had a new girlfriend and he wanted a divorce. Now, in church, Heather realized the preacher was finishing up his sermon, and she saw everyone standing up around her. She felt bad for not having paid much attention, so she stood up and smiled and spent an extra few minutes talking to other members of the congregation. And after the service was over, as Heather walked to her car, she told herself not to dwell on all the negative things in her life. Even though her marriage had fallen apart, God still provided for her. She had a great new boyfriend, she was part of a church filled with people who loved and cared about her, and she had a beautiful little boy. At around 6 p.m. that night, Heather drove across town to pick up Carson. But the little bit of hope she had started to feel after church had now disappeared, and she felt uneasy. She always felt like this when seeing Stephen, because their custody swap meetings had been tense from the beginning. Nearly every single time Heather and Stephen met to hand off Carson, they would get into an argument. The baby lived with Heather, and Stephen had him every other weekend, but Stephen had been arguing for joint custody because he wanted Carson to live with him half the time. The fights between the parents had gotten so bad at one point that Heather had insisted on doing the custody swaps in the parking lot of a busy shopping center.
Recently, though, the animosity had sort of leveled off. Stephen just wanted to be done with the divorce proceedings, so he had finally agreed to allow Heather full custody of their son. Still, though, Heather preferred to meet Stephen in public. When Heather pulled into the Target parking lot in the city of Snellville, Georgia that night, she saw Stephen was already there, waiting outside of his car. So Heather parked and then walked over to him. Stephen said a quick hello, and he lifted Carson out of his car and handed him over to Heather. And without saying anything else, Stephen got back in his car and drove out of the lot. But Heather was so happy to have her son back, she didn't even care that Stephen had barely acknowledged her. She had a huge smile on her face and talked to Carson as she carried him to her SUV. She opened the rear passenger door and carefully secured him in his car seat. Heather shut the door and walked around to the driver's side, and she heard footsteps coming up behind her. Heather turned around, and she was startled to see a strange-looking man standing there. He had wild hair and a thick mustache, and he had a messenger bag strapped around his shoulder. This man spoke to Heather, and when she heard what he said, she lunged for the door and tried to open it. Seconds later, shoppers in this busy Target parking lot heard the loud bang of a gunshot. Some of the shoppers just froze in complete terror, and others took off running and screaming, afraid the shooter would keep on firing. But a couple of the shoppers immediately turned in the direction of the sound, and they saw a man with wild hair calmly walking away from an SUV towards the woods that surrounded the shopping center. These shoppers rushed over to the SUV, and when they saw a woman slumped on the ground and blood covering her face, they called 911. Officer Neil Carter of the Snellville Police was patrolling in his cruiser not far from the target when he heard the call come through on the police radio. Carter instantly spun a U-turn and stepped on the gas. When he pulled into the Target parking lot, he saw a group of people already heading towards his car. Carter parked, stepped outside, and then walked directly into complete chaos. Everybody in the parking lot, all these people who had just been doing some Sunday shopping before they witnessed a shooting, descended on Officer Carter. And they were shouting and trying to tell him what they saw. But there were so many of them, and they were all so upset that Carter couldn't understand anything they were telling him. Carter held up his hands and told them to please step back. He needed everyone to calm down. But a few people in the crowd just kept on shouting. Clearly, they had something truly urgent. And they pointed Carter towards a parked SUV. Carter looked over and saw a woman's body lying on the ground by that SUV. He ran to her, but even from a few feet away, he could see the woman had been shot. Carter reached down to feel the woman's pulse, but he already knew she was dead. When Carter stood back up, he saw a woman from the crowd coming towards him, shouting. But this time, Carter understood exactly what he was hearing. This woman was shouting, "There's a baby in the back seat." Carter felt his heartbeat spike. He turned around and peered through the window, bracing himself for the sight of an injured child. Instead, to his relief, he saw a little boy, maybe a year and a half old, staring back at him with wide eyes. The little boy looked scared, but he was unharmed. Carter opened the door of the SUV, lifted up the boy, still in the car seat, and carried him to his police cruiser, setting him down in the back. At this point, Carter saw a wave of police and first responders arriving, and he saw the crowd rushing towards them like they did to him. Carter just looked at the baby in the back of his police car. Carter could barely think straight, and he wasn't sure what to do next. But at least this little boy was safe. Just then, Carter heard shouting behind him again, and he turned and saw another woman approaching him, waving her arms to get his attention. His first impulse was to tell her to stay back, but she pointed to a spot near the edge of the parking lot, and she said she had seen the shooter standing there before the shooting. This could be a solid lead, so Carter quickly refocused and started writing down the woman's account in his notebook. She said the shooter had been watching the victim from nearby, on the other side of a few parked cars. He was a short, slender man with an odd mustache and wild black hair, and he was wearing khaki pants and a blue button-up shirt. Carter thanked the woman and then shared her description of the shooter to the other officers at the scene. Carter stayed behind and arranged for the baby to be taken to the police station, while other officers fanned out and began searching the area around the target with canine units, hoping to find the suspect. The police dogs led their handlers to the edge of the parking lot, and then followed a scent through the woods surrounding the target into the parking lot of an adjacent hotel. But that's where the dogs lost the trail. The police figured the killer must have gotten into a vehicle parked at that location and driven off. Just beyond the hotel parking lot was a highway, and the officers knew that by now, the killer was probably miles away. Meanwhile, back at the crime scene, Officer Carter found the victim's purse with her license inside of it. Now they had an ID. Her name was Heather Strube. Soon after Officer Carter identified Heather, Lieutenant Trey Downs of the Snellville Police Department arrived at the Target parking lot. The place was still pretty chaotic, with police officers, witnesses, first responders, and police dogs spread out everywhere, but Lieutenant Downs looked completely unfazed by any of it. He quickly met with Officer Carter to get an update and also a description of the shooter. Then he walked right towards the target. As he got closer, he saw several security cameras mounted on the roof of the store pointing down at the parking lot, and he smiled. Downs had already figured that this store would have decent security, and now he believed these specific cameras would be the key to finding the shooter. Inside the store, Downs flagged down an employee and told her that he needed to see the security footage for the entire day. The employee led him through the store to a cramped room filled with multiple security screens. A man was already hunched over the screens, watching the scene currently unfolding in the parking lot. That man introduced himself to Downs as the director of security. Downs told him that he needed to see everything the cameras had picked up that evening, so the security director pulled up the footage. At first, as Downs examined each camera angle, he was disappointed. There were no cameras aimed directly at where Heather had parked, and so there was no footage of the actual shooting. But as he looked closely at the footage that they did have, Downs spotted a man who perfectly matched the description of the shooter. The man entered the parking lot on foot, walked in the direction of Heather's SUV, and a short time after, walked away toward the surrounding woods. The footage was low resolution. Downs asked if he could have the footage so he could send it off to the crime lab for possible enhancement. But the security director surprised him by saying that Target actually had its own forensics lab that was so good, Target had actually closed cases that even the FBI couldn't solve. The security director promised he'd get the footage out first thing in the morning and get the process started. Downs said that would be a huge help, and he headed out of the store. The sun was setting, and the parking lot looked calm and empty compared to how it had been when Downs first arrived. He saw crime scene investigators packing up their equipment for the night. One of them had called him over to tell him that Heather had been shot with a .38 caliber revolver, but the weapon itself had not been found at the scene, and neither had any clear fingerprints. This was not the news Downs was hoping for. So far, he had a good physical description of the suspect and some blurry video, but not much else. But he figured he did have at least one other thing to go on. This shooting did not appear to be a random attack. Downs believed Heather had been targeted. Heather's parents were out of town, driving through Alabama, when Heather's mom's cell phone began to ring. She picked it up and heard the voice of her father, Heather's grandfather, on the other end, and his voice was shaking. He told her that he had just been visited by the police, and he had some horrible news that he could barely even believe was true. The police had brought Carson to his house and told him that Heather had been murdered. Heather's mom screamed and hung up the phone. Heather's dad, who was driving, asked her what was going on. Heather's mom could barely get the words out, but she told him that their daughter had been killed. Heather's dad pulled over to the side of the road, and the two parents just sat there and wept. Then they turned the car around and began making the trip back home to Georgia. Several hours later, late on the night of the murder, Heather's parents walked into the Snellville police station and saw Lieutenant Downs waiting for them. Heather's parents looked completely dazed, like they barely knew where they were. They'd sped home from Alabama, almost without saying a word to each other. It was almost like if they didn't talk about what had happened, maybe it wasn't real. But earlier, they had gone right to Heather's grandfather's house, and when they saw him sitting with Heather's little boy in his lap, it had hit them. They had lost their daughter, and Carson had lost his mom. At the station, Lieutenant Downs said he was deeply sorry for their loss. He understood they were grieving and in shock, but every second counted in a homicide investigation, and so he couldn't wait to ask them questions. Heather's parents said they understood, and they followed Downs to his office and sat across from him at his desk. First, Downs wanted to know if they knew what their daughter was doing at the Target that evening. Was she just shopping? Heather's mom shook her head. She said Heather and her husband Stephen were separated, and they met at Target to hand off their son as part of their custody agreement. The custody battle had been ugly, she said. She paused, and in a quiet voice, she asked Lieutenant Downs if he thought Stephen could have had something to do with Heather's death. Downs was not surprised by this question. A husband going through a divorce was almost always suspect number one in a murder like this. It was his first thought too. But as an investigator, he liked to keep his evidence and theories under wraps as much as possible. But he did tell Heather's mom that they had a good description of the shooter and it didn't match Stephen. And beyond that, Stephen had been seen driving away from the parking lot at the exact time the killer approached. So no, he said, he did not think Stephen was the shooter. What Downs didn't say was that he had not ruled out the possibility that Stephen had hired someone else to kill his estranged wife. Downs told Heather's parents he just needed one more thing: a list of all the people who knew that Heather would be in that parking lot at that time of day for the custody swap. And after thinking for a few minutes, Heather's parents came up with about a dozen people, and Downs wrote down all the names. Downs told them again how sorry he was, and then he walked them out of the police station. Downs went back to his office and read over the list Heather's parents had just given him, and he decided there was no way around it. The only person it made sense to start with was Heather's estranged husband, Stephen Strube. The next morning, Lieutenant Downs and another officer arrived at a house in a quiet suburban neighborhood. This was Stephen's mom's house, and Downs discovered Stephen had started staying here after he and Heather had split up. Downs had barely slept, but nobody would ever know. He looked sharp and full of energy. He knocked on the door, and a young man answered it. Downs asked him if he was Stephen Strube, but the young man just said no, turned around, and walked away. Downs looked at the other officer, a little confused by what had just happened. Downs was about to shout at the young man to come back and talk to them when a middle-aged man walked up to the door and asked if he could help. So Downs asked him if Stephen was home, and the man laughed. He said, yes, Stephen was home. He was the one who just answered the door. Lieutenant Downs glanced over at the other officer again, and they both looked like they might start laughing. Stephen lying to their face and then just walking off was really strange. The middle-aged man invited Downs and the other officer inside the home and led them to the front room, where Stephen was now sitting on the couch. Downs immediately asked Stephen why he just pretended to be somebody else. And without missing a beat, Stephen said he was on probation for burglary and he'd violated his probation. So now he was just trying to dodge the cops. Downs told him that was not very smart, but he said they were here about something far more serious than Stephen breaking his probation. They were here because Stephen's wife had been murdered in the Target parking lot right after she had met up with him. Stephen got off the couch, and his attitude completely changed. He looked terrified, and he asked where his son was. Was Carson okay? Downs assured him Carson was safe and that he had not been hurt. Police had already taken him to stay with Heather's grandfather for the time being. Stephen collapsed on the couch and tried to catch his breath. Downs gave him a few minutes to collect himself, and then asked him about his relationship with Heather. Stephen struggled to focus, but he admitted he had not been a great husband. He had cheated on Heather, and he'd given her a really hard time about child custody during most of the divorce process. But he said he'd finally cut all of that out and had agreed to let Heather have full custody of Carson. And he said no matter how badly they might have fought about stuff, he never would have hurt Heather. Downs said they could wrap things up, at least for now. He just needed to know where Stephen went after meeting Heather at that Target. Stephen said he met up with his girlfriend, and then they got his car washed. After that, he came home to his mom's house and just hung out by himself because his mom was away visiting her parents. Downs could check with the girlfriend about the car wash, but Stephen had no real alibi for where he went after that. Still, Downs knew pinning down exactly where Stephen had been wouldn't necessarily help the investigation, because unless Stephen had the ability to be two places at once, he was not the one who pulled the trigger. So Downs told Stephen they'd follow up if they needed to, and then he and the other officer left the house and went back to the station. Sitting in his office, Downs felt conflicted. He thought Stephen could have paid someone to kill Heather because of the divorce, and in addition to that, Downs now knew Stephen had violated probation for another crime. But Downs had also seen how upset Stephen got when he thought something might have happened to his son, and Downs just felt like he couldn't be faking that. So, Downs began going back over the list of people Heather's parents had given him, and something hit him right away. And he admitted to himself it seemed pretty obvious. If Heather's husband didn't kill her, maybe her boyfriend did. Later that day, an officer led Heather's boyfriend, Mike Vickers, into an interview room at the station, where Lieutenant Downs was waiting. And right away, Downs noticed Mike's slight size. He was about 5 foot 7 inches tall, and he was slender, just like the suspect on the Target surveillance video. Mike sat across from Downs in the small, bright room, and Downs casually asked him what he had done the past weekend. almost like this was a conversation between two friends just catching up. Mike said on Saturday night, he and Heather had gone to his parents' house for game night. It was something they did on a lot of weekends. And on Sunday morning, they ate breakfast together before Heather headed out to church, and he went into work. Following up with Mike's employer to check if he'd really been there would be easy enough, so Downs shifted his focus. He asked Mike about the custody swaps between Heather and Stephen. Did he know how they worked? Did Heather say anything about the custody swap this past Sunday? Mike said he had actually gone to one of these custody swaps in the past, so he knew exactly how they worked. The swap he had gone to had been one when Heather was still kind of freaked out about meeting Stephen alone. Mike had driven to the Target with her, and he ran into the store to grab a few things before Stephen got there. But by the time he was leaving the store, Stephen had arrived and was handing the baby to Heather. So Mike had just hung back and watched from a distance. Lieutenant Downs sat quietly, just looking at Mike for a minute. This was a guy who fit the description of the killer, at least in part. He also knew exactly where Heather would be at the time of the shooting, and he most likely knew the layout of the Target parking lot and the surrounding area, because he had been there before. So Downs asked Mike if there had been any problems or tension lately between him and Heather. But Mike said he loved Heather, and that their relationship was awesome. They almost never fought, and they had even been talking about having kids and buying a house together. Not long after that, Downs finished up the interview and told Mike he was free to go. On the surface, Mike had seemed to be telling the truth about his and Heather's relationship, but that definitely wasn't enough for Downs to eliminate him as a suspect. After all, boyfriends could get jealous and do really stupid things, even if they were in a good relationship. And Downs knew if he could just get a clearer picture of the man from the surveillance video, he would know if Mike was the shooter or not. After the interview with Mike, Downs called the security director at Target to see when the enhanced images from the video would be ready. The security director said he had sent the footage off to the lab, but it would take at least a week for the lab technicians to finish their work. The idea of waiting around to get these images did not sit well with Downs. He wanted to keep moving forward, and he knew there had been a whole parking lot full of people who had at least caught a glimpse of the suspected killer. That evening, still only about 24 hours after the murder, Downs had his team bring in as many people who had witnessed the shooting as they could. And Downs had all these witnesses sit with a sketch artist who then drew a composite based on the descriptions of the killer that the witnesses provided. But when Downs and the other investigators saw the completed drawing, they thought it might be a joke. This killer with the huge hair and big mustache looked like a caricature, or like Sonny Bono, the famous singer from the 1960s and 70s. But all of the witnesses looked at the drawing, and every one of them swore that was what the killer looked like. Downs was pretty sure he was not looking for a famous singer, so he resigned himself to the fact that he was going to have to wait for the images from the lab to get a clear picture of what this man really looked like. And this frustrated him, because he felt like until he had those images, he and his team would just be sort of treading water. But the next day, 2 days after the murder, Downs was in his office going over his notes when an officer rushed in and said he needed to come quick. A phone call had just come into the tip line, and the caller said he had seen the killer up close. Downs didn't hesitate. He got up, walked across the station, and grabbed the phone from the officer who was manning the tip line. Downs quickly introduced himself and asked the caller to tell him everything. The caller said he happened to be at that hotel that was right by the Target on the day before the shooting, and he had seen this really strange-looking guy lingering in the hotel parking lot. But that wasn't all. This weird guy was clearly staking out the area. He was looking through a pair of binoculars, and then he took a bunch of photos. And then when the guy was done taking the photos, he hopped in a Ford F-150 pickup truck and took off. Downs, who prided himself on almost always remaining calm, felt a huge rush of excitement. He asked the caller if he managed to get the truck's license plate number. But the caller said he didn't. However, he said the truck was white, and it had a really distinctive black trim all around it. Downs got even more excited. A license plate number would have been perfect, but this description was still huge. Downs got the caller's info and then hung up the phone. He quickly gathered his team, and they ran a search through motor vehicle records for all the white Ford F-150s registered in the county. And when Downs saw the name of one of the people who owned a Ford F-150 in town, he thought he might have just found Heather's killer. Later that afternoon, Lieutenant Downs drove through a quiet suburban neighborhood with the hotel witness sitting next to him in the passenger seat. Downs spotted the house he was looking for and stopped the car. He pointed to the white truck parked in the driveway, and the hotel witness looked at it through the passenger side window. And when he saw it, the witness immediately said that that was the truck he'd seen the strange-looking man get into at the hotel. There was no mistaking the distinct black trim all around it. Downs said that was great news. He thanked the witness for coming along, then he hit the gas and sped away from the house. The following day, which was only 3 days after the shooting, police got a search warrant for the house where the white truck was parked, and they impounded the truck and brought it in for a forensics search. And the forensics team quickly discovered that the truck had clearly been recently cleaned, because it was absolutely immaculate inside. This made it difficult for them to find anything useful in the truck, so they sent it to the Georgia Bureau of Investigations lab to undergo trace evidence testing, hoping the state lab might be able to find something that they couldn't. In the meantime, Downs and his team cataloged everything they had taken when they searched the house where the white truck had been found. And the more evidence Downs saw, the more confident he became that he had found the killer. Still, Downs wanted to make sure his case was airtight before he made an arrest. He didn't want to bring the killer into police custody just to have the district attorney's office tell him that the case wasn't strong enough to argue in court. But Downs didn't have to wait too long to get another big piece of evidence. A little over a week after the murder, the Target lab sent the enhanced surveillance images to Downs. And as the lieutenant looked at these images, he saw something that he believed would help him close this case. On the afternoon that Lieutenant Downs got the images, he led Heather's estranged husband, Stephen, into one of the station's interview rooms. Downs sat Stephen down at a table that had a laptop sitting on it. Downs flipped open the laptop and pulled up several images. He told him that these were enhanced images that had been pulled from Target surveillance footage taken on the evening Heather was killed. Downs leaned in and asked Stephen if he recognized the man with the big hair and the mustache in the images. Stephen stared at the screen, and then he dropped his head and looked down at the floor. Without looking up at Downs, he just said he did recognize this man. Lieutenant Downs felt like this investigation had just been wrapped up in a nice little bow. He knew it would still take time to compile all the evidence and put together the strongest case possible, but in that moment, Downs was sure that he knew who killed Heather Strube. Based on the parking lot surveillance images, suspect and witness interviews, and evidence collected throughout the investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Heather on the evening of April 26, 2009. At around 6 p.m., the killer crouched down behind a row of parked cars at the edge of the Target parking lot, tightened the messenger bag slung over their shoulder, and watched Heather and Stephen's custody swap. When Heather started putting baby Carson into her car, the killer began walking fast right towards her. Heather heard the killer's footsteps approaching, and she turned around to see this bizarre-looking man standing there. The killer spoke, and it frightened Heather. So much so that she turned and tried to open up her driver's side door to get away, but the killer immediately pushed themselves between Heather and her SUV, and then before Heather could even call out for help, the killer reached into their bag, pulled out a revolver, pressed the muzzle right against Heather's forehead, and squeezed the trigger. There was a deafening bang, and then Heather crumpled to the ground as blood began to pour from the wound in her head. The killer heard screaming coming from all of the shoppers who had just witnessed this, but the killer did not panic. Instead, they turned and calmly walked across the Target parking lot, through the surrounding woods, and into the nearby hotel parking lot. There, the killer got into their truck that they had left parked right there, they drove off, and pulled onto the highway. Once the killer was far enough away, they peeled off their fake mustache and removed their wig. A cheap disguise, but one they knew would conceal their identity. Because neither Heather's husband nor her boyfriend killed her. Her mother-in-law, Joanna, did. It turned out Stephen's mother, Joanna, did not like Heather at all. And she had told different people on several occasions that she did not think Heather was a good mother and that Heather should not have custody of Carson. Now, Joanna was not anywhere near the top of Lieutenant Downs' suspect list when the investigation started. After all, he thought he was searching for a strange-looking man. But then, Downs discovered that the distinctive white Ford F-150 truck was registered to Joanna. And when that truck was sent to the state lab for further testing, they lifted a single fiber from the truck's interior, and that fiber was determined to be synthetic hair, most likely from a wig. So Downs started to rethink everything. Maybe that strange-looking man on the surveillance video, the suspected killer, was really a woman in disguise. And when he saw the enhanced images from Target's lab and rewatched the entire surveillance video, he was sure he was right, and that Joanna was the person in the wig and fake mustache. And when Downs showed the surveillance images to Stephen, he recognized his mother through the disguise. But even after that, Downs and his team wanted to lock their case down further, and they eventually discovered that Joanna had owned a .38 caliber Rossi revolver. Now, Joanna's gun was never actually found, but ballistics tests confirmed that a .38 caliber Rossi was one of only 2 types of revolvers that could have fired the bullet that killed Heather. And with that final piece of information, Downs and his team made their arrest. Joanna was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison with possibility of parole in 30 years. She was prohibited from having any contact with Heather's family, including her grandson, Carson. Heather's parents were granted full custody of Carson and are raising him themselves, but they do make sure he continues to have a relationship with his father, Stephen Stroop. Police do not believe that Stephen had anything to do with Heather's murder, or that he knew his mother was involved. That is, until he saw the surveillance footage. Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballin Podcast. If you like today's story and you're looking for more strange, dark, and mysterious content, be sure to check out all our studio's podcasts. They are this one, the Mr. Ballin Podcast. We also have Mr. Ballin's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, and also Runful. To find those other podcasts, all you have to do is search for Ballin Studios wherever you listen to your podcasts. To watch hundreds more stories, just like the one you heard today, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballin. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. In late July of 1988, 2 hunters were walking up the steep mountain trail in Colorado looking for a place to set up for the day. As they were walking, they eventually left the trail and began meandering through the trees looking for a clearing. At some point, they spotted one, but in the clearing was this really bright white thing sitting at the base of one of the trees. So the 2 hunters who were curious walked up to see what this white thing was, and when they actually were close enough to get a good look at it, they both immediately knew this was something no one was supposed to see. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, the next time the Amazon Music follow button is at work, secretly sneak into their home and train their brand new puppy to bark at shadows and pee behind the washing machine. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the afternoon of June 15th, 1988, a man named Keith Reinard drove down the main street of a tiny town called Silver Plume, which is located in the Rocky Mountains of Colorado. In his car was everything Keith would need to live for the next 3 months. Silver Plume was the kind of place that most people would just pass by on the highway without even considering stopping. It was kind of a no-name town in the middle of nowhere. In the 1800s, it had been a booming mining town. However, now all but 140 of its residents had either died or moved away. In fact, Silver Plume was considered a living ghost town because of how close it was to being totally abandoned. But this emptiness and kind of middle of nowhere-ness was exactly what appealed to Keith about this town. Keith was 49 years old and lived over 1,000 miles away to the east in a suburb of Chicago, Illinois. And Keith had a great life. He was married with 2 kids, a boy and a girl. He had a good job working for a newspaper covering high school sports, and he had a beautiful house. But for Keith, he felt like as good as his life looked on paper, it was missing something. There was one thing he had always wanted to do, but had always put off doing, and that was to write a book. And not just any book. A book that lots of people were going to read, a great American classic. That's what he wanted to make. But there was just one problem. Keith had no idea what this big book was going to be about. And that was why he had come to Silverplume. Keith had taken a 3-month leave from his job and left his wife and his kids and the city all behind to come out to this town to hopefully, in this new, peaceful, quiet environment, find the inspiration he really needed to not only discover what this book would be about, but to sit down and actually write it. Keith's wife had not been happy about this plan, him kind of being gone for 3 months, not providing any income, not helping with the kids. But she could tell Keith really felt like he needed to do this, and so she gave him her blessing. After arriving on Main Street in Silverplume, Keith looked up and he saw KP Cafe off to the right. It was a weathered old building that looked like it was straight out of a cowboy movie, and this cafe was exactly the landmark that Keith had been looking for. And so he pulled his car over on the side of the road, he got out, he stretched, and then he began walking towards this cafe. This cafe was the big hangout spot in Silverplume for all of its 140 residents, and the reason Keith knew this was because his best friend from high school, Ted Parker, owned KP Cafe. Ted had actually been the person who inspired Keith to come to Silverplume in the first place. He had told him about how peaceful and serene this place was, the best environment for a writer. And when Keith had told Ted that sounds great, I'm going to do it, I'm going to come to Silverplume, Ted had told him that he also owned the store right next to KP Cafe. It used to be a bookstore, but the previous tenant who ran the bookstore had talked about some big European vacation he was going on and then had just kind of vanished. And so for months now, this storefront had been vacant. And so Ted had told Keith that while he was in town, he was more than welcome to work and write out of this vacant bookshop. And so Keith, after walking up to the front window of KP Cafe, he looked inside and didn't see Ted, and so he decided he would take a moment and walk over to this vacant bookshop that would be his office. So he went next door, he pulled out the key that Ted had already sent him in advance, he unlocked the door, and he went inside. And right away, Keith was struck at what he saw. I mean, the place was full of books. Some piles of books were higher than his head, and many of the books looked rare and expensive. And Keith's first thought was, why did this guy who used to run this store just abandon all of this? This had to cost a lot of money. But Keith was far too excited about the next few months and getting this book done that he didn't really think too hard about whatever the previous owner had done. And instead, he just began to daydream about what the next few months would be like and how this book was going to turn out. And as Keith was thinking about his big book project, Ted actually came into the bookstore, and when the two friends saw each other, they ran up to each other and embraced, and then before long, the two of them had gone outside and began walking around Silverplume, just chatting and catching up. And eventually, after chatting and walking around for a really long time, the pair left Silverplume and wound up walking onto this hiking trail that went up into the woods. Now, years earlier, Ted and Keith had both been avid hikers and outdoorsmen, but now, Keith had put on some weight and he really wasn't a big hiker anymore, but Ted didn't really know that. And so Ted, he's leading this hike up this trail as they're still kind of chatting and making light of things. But Keith, as he was struggling to keep up, was getting more and more anxious about this hike, and he also had a deep fear of heights, and this trail appeared to go really high up this mountain. But Keith kept telling himself that, he was here in Silverplume as much to write this book as he was to kind of have a little more adventure in his life. And so he just kept on trudging along after Ted. But eventually, Keith just could not handle how high up they were getting. He was totally terrified of being able to see the valley way down below. And so he had a sort of panic attack where he lunged and grabbed a nearby tree and hugged it like it was the only thing keeping him from falling off the mountain. And when Ted turned around and saw Keith, he rushed over to him and said, "Don't worry, everything is okay." He convinced him to let go of the tree, and then very carefully, Keith and Ted walked back down the trail back into town. And when they got down there, Ted would tell Keith he was so sorry for putting Keith in such a stressful position, and Keith kind of brushed it off and said, "It's totally fine, no big deal." Even though this panic attack was very embarrassing for Keith, he wound up just kind of shifting his mental focus to getting settled into this new life he was going to be living for the next few months. And so along with this office space in this old abandoned bookstore that Keith would be using, he also rented a small apartment in the little church in town. And very quickly, Keith developed a sort of daily routine. He would get up early in his apartment and he would make his way over to the bookstore and he would sit down at his computer and he would write all day. But even though Keith was doing a lot of writing, it was not productive writing. It was mostly Keith sitting down, trying to come up with the topic for his book, not being able to do it, and then he just sort of drifted off and began doing journal entries and writing snippets of poetry, and then before long the day was over and he had accomplished nothing. And so at the end of June, roughly 2 weeks after Keith had arrived in town, he was sitting at his computer one morning inside of the bookshop, unable to write anything productive, and he told himself, you know what, I gotta do something to break out of this writer's block. Writer's block is when writers kind of hit a psychological wall and just can't seem to be creative. They can't write. And so Keith decided, in order to kind of get out of this funk, that he would go back up into the mountains again. He would face his fear of heights, and he would get to the summit, and that clean mountain air and all the nature around him would kind of bring him back to reality and give him the inspiration he would need to just write this book. And so Keith turned off his computer, he left the bookstore, he went back to his apartment in the church, he packed some sandwiches and some water into a backpack, and then he walked from the church apartment to the nearby trail that would lead out of Silver Plume and up into the forest and into the mountains. It was a hot day that day, but as soon as Keith was underneath the shade of all the trees, it was very cool, and the sounds of the birds and the insects and other animals all around him was very calming. But very quickly, Keith's hike went from very peaceful and relatively flat to very intimidating and very steep. But Keith, he was determined to do this hike. He felt like it was a critical step in the creation of this book. And so he just kept on going one foot after another, huffing and panting and making his way up this incredibly steep trail. And it was like with every step he took, he felt braver and braver. And suddenly he was able to look down at the valley below and not feel as frightened. And then at some point, as he was walking up, he saw all these scratch marks on a tree that were obviously from a mountain lion. But instead of Keith feeling scared, he felt more brave. He felt excited. He felt like this is what he came here for. This book and adventure kind of coming together in this moment. Finally, Keith made it to the top of this trail and he found this incredible clearing that looked down over the town below. And in this clearing was a monument to a man named Clifford Griffin who had died at this exact spot 100 years earlier. Keith knew Clifford's story. Back in 1887, when Silver Plume was a booming mining town, Clifford, who was a mine owner, came up to this exact spot in the mountains to play his violin. And then after playing it for a bit, he stopped and dug a grave, stood on the edge of it, shot himself, and fell into the hole. No one knew why he did that, but within a couple of years, the mining industry came to a halt in Silver Plume and everybody just kind of vanished. And very quickly, rumors began to swirl around the people who remained in Silver Plume, how, their town must be cursed. And maybe it was connected to what happened to poor old Clifford. After staring at this monument for a few minutes, Keith turned his attention to lunch. He pulled off his backpack, took out a sandwich, and he began eating. And as he ate, he looked back at this monument, and he thought of another strange Silver Plume story, except this one hit much closer to home. It was about the man who used to run the bookstore where Keith now did all of his writing out of. This man's name was Tom Young, and it would turn out what Keith had heard about Tom when Keith first arrived in Silver Plume was not entirely correct. Keith had been told that Tom had been talking about this European vacation, and so the consensus was that, he had left town and gone to Europe and just not come back. But the reality was, once Keith began asking around a little bit over those first couple of weeks he was there, was that Tom actually had been talking about this big European vacation, but then had walked into the woods up into the mountains, where Keith was right now, where this monument was, and Tom had just vanished, apparently, in these mountains. Tom apparently had been a very quirky guy who had come to Silver Plume in the 1970s to kind of start a new life for himself. He had been teaching high school students in Denver, but he apparently didn't really like doing that and wanted to start over, and so that was what drew him to Silver Plume. And in Silver Plume, residents always saw Tom, along with his best friend, Gus, his black Labrador retriever, walking around town playing fetch. But instead of using a ball, Tom would throw a chewed-up doll's head. And then, on September 7th, 1987, so roughly 9 months before Keith arrived in Silver Plume, Tom and his dog Gus had gone for a hike in the woods where Keith was, and then vanished. Now, at first, people assumed that because Tom had been talking a lot about going on this European vacation right before he vanished, that must be where he went. But when people checked his shop, they saw all of his books were still in there. It did not appear like he had packed things up. And when the sheriff looked into it, he couldn't find any evidence that Tom had ever bought any plane tickets to go to Europe. And so no one really knew what happened to Tom. It was like this big mystery. And so as Keith was standing in this clearing near this monument thinking about Tom and his story, Keith began to realize there were a lot of similarities between him, Keith, and Tom. They both, as adults, had come to Silver Plume, this kind of random place in the middle of Colorado, to get a sort of second chance in life. And they both worked out of the exact same storefront. And Keith had done some additional digging on Tom when he heard about this mystery and learned that they were almost the exact same age. Their birthdays were separated by 1 day. Also, Keith discovered that he and Tom had served in the military at almost the exact same time in the 1960s. And so as Keith was going over all these strange coincidences and weird similarities between his life and Tom's, suddenly Keith stopped chewing his sandwich and just quickly packed everything back up. He turned and began running down the trail, going back towards town. And as he ran, Keith smiled because he realized he had just discovered what his great American classic novel was going to be about. It was going to be about Tom. For the entire month of July, all Keith did was write. He was in his office 7 days a week typing away, and then at night, when he went back to his apartment, his neighbors would see the lights on all night long. At the end of July, so by this point, Keith has been living in Silver Plume for about a month and a half, 2 hunters from Silver Plume began hiking up that same mountain trail that led up into the mountains and into the forest that Keith had gone on recently and found his inspiration for his novel. And so these 2 hunters, they're making their way up the trail, and at some point they leave the marked trail and begin kind of meandering through the trees. And as they're walking, they're kind of looking for a clearing to set up for the day. And at one point, one of the hunters happens to look up and he sees there's this really bright white thing sitting at the base of a tree in a clearing. And so these 2 hunters make their way up to this bright white thing, and as soon as they're looking down at it, they realize they have very likely stumbled on a crime scene. At their feet was this green tarp that was partially exposing this white skeleton underneath. And when they pulled back the green tarp a little bit, they saw it was a human skeleton and a dog skeleton kind of lying next to each other as if the 2 of them had lied down and died there. But what was immediately apparent to these 2 hunters is that both the human skull and the dog skull had gaping holes in them, like they had been shot. And several feet away from the skeletons was a rusted pistol. And so these 2 hunters, after staring at the scene in front of them for a couple of seconds, they took a mental note of where they were on the mountain, and then they turned around and headed back down to town to tell the sheriff. And when the sheriff went up with his deputies to go search the scene themselves, they very quickly identified that these remains belonged to Tom Young and his dog Gus. And the sheriff also found out that that pistol that was found several feet away from the 2 skeletons had been purchased by Tom just a few days before he had vanished. And so the sheriff decided that what must have happened is Tom brought his dog up into the mountains, and after shooting his dog, Tom turned and shot himself. This was a suicide. Case closed. But this explanation didn't make any sense to the people of Silver Plume. First of all, Tom loved his dog Gus. Gus was basically like his child because Tom didn't have any other family, and so why would he hurt his dog? Also, Tom was not acting remotely like someone who was going to commit suicide in the days leading up to his death. People saw him at the grocery store buying a whole bunch of groceries. He talked endlessly about how excited he was about this big European vacation. And then there was this one other thing that also made suicide seem very unlikely. When those two hunters had discovered Tom and Gus, they were partially covered by that green plastic tarp. But it looked very much like the wind and kind of nature in general had blown the tarp off of them, revealing the white bones that the hunters had seen. But what that meant is that very likely that tarp at one point had been totally covering their bodies. And so between that and the fact that the gun was located several feet away from where Tom was, it seemed to the people of Silver Plume that probably somebody else had shot and killed both Tom and Gus, covered them up with this tarp, and then dumped the gun several feet away. Adding to the theory that this was a murder, not a suicide, were the rumors around town that there was this nuclear weapon production facility somewhere near their town, and apparently they were illegally dumping radioactive materials into these old abandoned mine shafts near and in Silver Plume. And people thought, maybe Tom, who had military training, he was actually in the special forces in the military, maybe he had gone out and done some snooping around and discovered this illegal dumping operation, and that got him killed. When Keith heard that Tom and Gus's bodies had been discovered up in the mountains, it was absolutely devastating for Keith. Even though Keith had never actually met Tom, he still felt like he had a bond with Tom. I mean, he was obsessively writing about Tom and learning everything about him, and he also had all these similarities with Tom, and so it was a really big deal to find out that Tom and Gus were dead. But the silver lining to this tragedy was that Keith was now armed with more information about Tom and his dog, and suddenly the ending to his big novel became clear. And so Keith got right back to work. On August 3rd, 1988, so a couple of days after Tom and Gus's skeletons were found up in the mountains, the town of Silver Plume held a memorial service for Tom. And Keith, he would attend this service, and as he listened to the people of Silver Plume talking about Tom and how he had come to Silver Plume to get this second chance at life, Keith couldn't help but feel like it was almost like he was watching his own memorial service because Tom's life so closely mirrored his own. And then, as he was listening to more and more people talk, Keith started to feel like there was no way Tom killed himself. That can't be what happened. Something else happened to Tom. And Keith was confident that through his research and through doing this book about Tom, he would figure out what happened to him and his dog. As soon as the memorial service ended, Keith quickly slipped out and headed back to his apartment. And when he went inside, he looked around at all the stacks of papers and maps and books that he was using to put together this novel. And he knew that out of all this chaos around him, this novel really was becoming a thing. He was doing it. He was gonna get this book done. But he knew there was one more thing he had to do before he could finish this book. And that was, he had to go back up into the mountains. So a few days later, on August 7th, at around 4:30 in the afternoon, Keith walked inside of KP Cafe and strolled up to the counter where his buddy, Ted Parker, was sitting there reading a book. Keith paid for a drink and then announced to Ted that he, Keith, was going to leave this cafe and go right up into the mountains again. And so as Keith told Ted his big plan for this hike he was going to go on, Ted just felt totally confused. Ted's looking at Keith knowing this guy is not a confident climber. I mean, they had gone on that one hike partway up the mountain, and Keith had had a panic attack and had to go back down again. Also, at the top of the mountain, it was like 12,000 feet of elevation where the temperatures would be near or below freezing, and here Keith was just wearing a flannel shirt and jeans. He had no other equipment with him, no other warm clothes. Also, the route that Keith was describing to Ted would take at least 6 hours round trip, and it's 4:30 p.m. now. And so Ted's thinking, Keith is going to get trapped up in the mountains in the middle of the night. And so Ted finally says to Keith, "I hope you're joking." But Keith would say, "I am not joking. And in fact, I'm leaving right now." And then before Ted could even protest, Keith turned around and, while sipping his drink, just casually walked out of the store and began heading towards the mountains. And Ted, he thought about stopping Keith and really talking some sense into him and getting him not to do this hike. But ultimately, Ted decided to do nothing, and he told himself that he would just check on Keith the next day. And so, the next morning, Ted, instead of going to his cafe, went first to the bookstore next door to see if Keith was in there. But when he got to the door, it was clear Keith was not inside, and the door was locked, and everything was dark. And so, trying not to panic, Ted hopped right back into his car, and he drove over to the church apartment where Keith had been staying. But again, Keith was not there. And right away, Ted is like, oh my goodness, Keith is stuck up on the mountain right now. Exactly what I thought was going to happen has happened. And so right away, Ted rushed to the sheriff to tell him that Keith was missing. And after hearing what Ted had to say, the sheriff would end up launching one of the biggest search and rescue efforts in the history of Colorado. Within 24 hours of being informed of Keith's absence, there were hundreds of people, professional searchers, and just locals who wanted to help, combing this mountain trail looking for Keith. There were planes overhead, there were tracking dogs. I mean, this was a really big deal. And by this point, Keith was very well known in Silver Plume. It's a tiny place. Everybody knows each other, and everyone knew that, he was working on this big book. And so people were really worried about Keith. He was one of theirs. But also, the townspeople were very creeped out by the fact that, Keith, who they knew was very similar to Tom, they knew he was writing about Tom, they knew that Keith was working out of the same storefront that Tom had been in, that now Keith had apparently vanished under the exact same circumstances as Tom. He had wandered into the woods, and that was it. And so it just felt like, how could they have these two people go missing in the exact same way? It just wasn't adding up. On August 9th, so 2 days after Keith had gone missing, and so by this point he's still missing, Ted and some friends decided they would go to Keith's apartment and look around and see if maybe there was some clue as to where Keith went or what he was going to do on this hike. And so they went into his apartment, and Ted's friends began fanning out and looking in the bedroom and looking through all the papers and documents all over the floor, and Ted sat down at Keith's computer. And so Ted fired it up. And as soon as it loaded, there was just this one document on the desktop, and it was the book that Keith was writing. And so Ted clicked on it. And right away, after reading just a couple of lines, he was yelling for his friends to come over here and look at this. And one by one, each of these guys came over, and they just could not believe what they were looking at. From the first page of Keith's book, it was clear the setting for his book was Silver Plume, except he renamed it White Plume. He had created all these fictional characters as well that were obviously based on real people, but had renamed them as well. But that was not what shocked Ted and his friends. What shocked them was the main character of this book. His name was Guy Gypsum. Guy Gypsum was a military veteran who had come to White Plume looking for a better life and an opportunity to be closer to nature in rural Colorado. Guy was almost 50 years old, he loved to go hiking, and he worked out of a storefront that was right next to the only cafe in town. Guy Gypsum was both Keith and Tom at the same time. Keith basically had taken Tom's life and Keith's own life and merged them to create this composite character. And when Ted and his friends scrolled to the bottom of this document, they realized that Keith had written an ending for Guy Gypsum's character. These are the final words in this document. Guy Gypsum changed into some hiking boots and donned a heavy flannel shirt. He understood it all now, and his motivations. Guy closed the door and then walked off towards the lush, shadowless Colorado forests above. 5 days later, the search for Keith was called off. He was never found. Some people say Keith wandered up into the mountains and accidentally died of exposure, and someday we'll find his remains somewhere in the forest. But others say, after reading that final line in Keith's book, that Keith did all this on purpose. I mean, he literally lived out the final part of his book.
He put on his boots and his heavy flannel shirt and his jeans, and he wandered off into the lush, shadowless Colorado forest above and killed himself in order to perhaps get closer to Tom Young, the man he had kind of become obsessed with after learning they were so similar, and the man he kind of like meshed his own life with and created this weird composite character of these two lives. I mean, it seemed like a guy that had kind of spiraled into madness in writing this book and decided that death was the only way to finish the novel. And still others say, maybe there really is some kind of secret illicit operation happening in or around Silver Plume. Maybe it's that radioactive waste getting dumped into the mines that, Tom discovered and that got him killed. And Keith, in researching Tom, also discovered this illegal thing and that got Keith killed as well. But all of those things are just theories because today, officially, there is no answer as to what happened to Keith. His case is still open.
Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballin podcast. If you enjoyed today's story and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. Those are Mr. Ballin's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, and Runfool. Just search for Ballin Studios wherever you get your podcasts and you will find all of them. Also, there are hundreds more stories like the one you listened to today, but in video format on our YouTube channel. And our YouTube channel is just called Mr. Ballin. Go check it out. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Some of the world's worst killers are not actually human, and today's podcast features 2 stories that demonstrate that. The audio from both of these stories has been pulled from our main YouTube channel and has been remastered for today's episode. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear is called A Few Drops, and it's about a seemingly meaningless event that turns into a nightmare for one world-renowned chemist. The second and final story you'll hear is called Unknown Unnatural Hazard. And as scary as this story is, the most terrifying part about it is that it could actually happen again somewhere else at any time. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to make the Amazon Music follow button a s'more, but instead of chocolate, use mud. Okay, let's get into our first story called A Few Drops. In January of 1997, a very accomplished and Ivy League-trained American chemist named Karen Wetterhahn started experiencing tingling in her lower extremities. Now, it was uncomfortable, but it wasn't enough discomfort to warrant going to a doctor or really being concerned about it. She figured it was just something kind of minor and it would go away on its own. But shortly after this tingling began, Karen started noticing she was having balance issues. She would be walking down the hallway at the university where she worked when inexplicably she would just lose her balance and start stumbling and would either fall to the ground or would have to lean up against the wall to steady herself. She tried to convince herself that she was just being clumsy or that she was just really tired and that's what was causing it. But shortly after these balance issues presented themselves, Karen was hit with a host of other health issues. Her speech became awkwardly slow and slurred. She began hearing this white noise ringing in her ear that just wouldn't go away. And her field of vision drastically narrowed to the point where it was like she was looking through 2 toilet paper rolls. Karen's husband brought her to the hospital where she underwent this very lengthy and involved examination, which involved spinal taps and brain scans to try to figure out what was going on because at first, none of the doctors had any idea. After the testing was complete and Karen was sleeping in a hospital bed and her husband was sitting by her side, a doctor walked into the room with a clipboard, and he had this odd look on his face, like the news he was about to deliver he didn't really even understand. And so he consulted his clipboard one more time, looking at some paperwork, and then he looked up and he looked at Karen, and then he turned to Karen's husband, and he just says to him, "Sir, does your wife have any enemies?" It would turn out Karen was suffering from a severe case of mercury toxicity. Mercury is a naturally occurring metallic element that is poisonous to humans in all its forms. And Karen had so much mercury in her body, in fact she had 80 times the toxic threshold, that doctors believed this had to have been an intentional poisoning, that someone must have attacked Karen trying to kill her with mercury. But Karen's husband said, I don't think my wife has any enemies. And then when Karen ultimately woke up, she reiterated that sentiment, that she did not have any enemies. The doctors, who knew Karen was a chemist, they asked her, have you had any recent exposure to mercury? And through slurred and difficult to understand speech, Karen would say that she had. In fact, over the last 6 months leading up to this hospital visit, Karen had had lots of exposure to mercury, because she was actually in charge of this huge $7 million research project that was looking to investigate the effects certain metals had on human health. And one of the metals she was studying was mercury. But Karen assured the doctor that anytime she handled any of these metals, she was always very, very cautious, especially when she handled mercury, because she understood how hazardous it was. She said she always wore the proper protective equipment to make sure none of the substances made contact with her skin. And she worked under this big chemical hood, which is like a big vacuum, to ensure she didn't accidentally inhale any of the toxic fumes that came off of these metals. The doctor was totally stumped and went silent for a second, and then Karen at some point broke the silence by saying, well, there was one time I did have a spill with mercury, but it was totally meaningless, and I haven't thought about it until just now, only because we're trying to figure out what happened. She would go on to tell the doctor about an incident that occurred 5 months earlier. She had been working at her lab at the university where she was employed when she accidentally spilled 1 or 2 tiny droplets of mercury onto the top of her left hand near her thumb. Now, she was wearing all of the prescribed protective equipment, including latex gloves on her hand, and so when she saw these droplets on her hand, she wasn't concerned for her health, she just followed procedure. She stopped what she was doing, she wiped the droplets off, and then she left her workstation, she threw away the contaminated gloves, she thoroughly washed her hands, and then put new gloves on, and then just went back to work and didn't think much of it. The type of mercury that Karen had spilled on her hand was called dimethylmercury. This is not the same thing as the shiny silver liquid we see in old thermometers. That is a hazardous substance, but it's nothing compared to dimethylmercury. Dimethylmercury is a clear liquid that is considered to be one of the most toxic substances on the planet. After hearing this story from Karen, the doctor agreed that overall this did seem like a kind of meaningless event because she had followed all the proper procedures and those droplets had landed on her gloves, not on her skin. But since they had no other leads to operate on, he thought it would still be a good idea to test to see if dimethylmercury could penetrate through latex. And sure enough, after they ran some studies, they found it could. In fact, the latex gloves that all these scientists were told to wear when handling this particular substance, they did nothing. The dimethylmercury would penetrate through the latex in seconds. But even though they had just solved the mystery of how Karen got mercury toxicity in the first place, what no one could understand was why Karen was still suffering from the effects of mercury toxicity if her only exposure to it was 5 months earlier, just that one time. Typically, people who have mercury toxicity, they will get better as soon as the source of their toxicity is removed. Meaning, when the mercury goes away, they get better. And it's because the mercury kind of pools in their bloodstream and their body will naturally excrete it and they'll get better. But unfortunately for Karen, it would turn out dimethylmercury is a little bit different. It's far more lipophilic than other types of mercury. Lipophilic means a chemical substance is more likely to bind and mix with fat tissue in the body. And since blood is primarily made of water, when dimethylmercury enters the body, it does not settle in the bloodstream. Instead, it settles in organs that are made up of primarily fat. And once dimethylmercury is in your organs, it takes an exponentially longer amount of time for your body to excrete it, if it ever does. Sometimes you just die from the effects of mercury toxicity before your body can get rid of it. And in Karen's case, when she showed up to the hospital, it was already too late. Some of the dimethylmercury had already made its way up to her brain, which is an organ made up of 60% fat, and there it began to destroy her central nervous system. 3 weeks after being admitted to the hospital, Karen fell into a coma, and then shortly after, one of Karen's friends was in the hospital visiting her, and she saw a tear was coming down Karen's face. And so the friend turned to the doctor and said, is she in pain? Is that why she's crying? And the doctor said, no, it doesn't appear her brain is able to register pain anymore. Karen would unfortunately never wake up from her coma. She would pass away on June 8th, 1997, roughly 10 months after those little droplets of dimethylmercury landed on her latex glove. The next and final story of today's episode is called Unknown Unnatural Hazard. Before sunrise on August 22nd, 1986, a man named Ephraim Che woke up feeling groggy and confused. As he lay in his bed inside of his small mud brick house perched up on a cliff, he tried to remember what happened the night before. He didn't know why, but he knew, something happened last night. I gotta remember it. But as he lay there kind of jogging his memory, he felt like there were holes in his memory, like he couldn't quite piece together what had happened the day or night before. However, there was one thing he distinctly remembered about the night before, and that was at some point he had heard one really loud boom of thunder outside. And Ephraim, kind of somewhere in the back of his mind, had thought, oh, it's going to rain tonight, and maybe when I wake up, it'll still be raining. And then Ephraim, no matter how hard he focused, he couldn't really remember how much time passed after hearing that booming sound and then getting in his bed the night before. But at some point, he remembered being in his bed and feeling kind of sick. And that was it. That was his whole memory of the night before. And so that morning, August 22nd, when Ephraim has suddenly woken up feeling confused, he rolled over and he looked out the window right nearby his bed, and he looked outside and he saw the sky was clear and the grass was totally dry. There was no indication that it had rained anytime recently. And so Ephraim is thinking to himself, something is definitely off here, but I just can't get my mind right. And so finally, Ephraim just sits up in his bed, he swings his legs out of his bed onto the ground, he stands up and practically falls over once he's on his feet. But he eventually gets himself back up, kind of steadies himself, and then he thinks, okay, I need to go check on my 4 kids and make sure they're okay. But the second Ephraim began to move in his house, it was like his body didn't obey his mind. Because moments later, instead of checking on his kids, Ephraim had wandered out his front door and was just standing out in front of his house, just kind of staring off into the distance, having no idea why he walked out there. The village where Ephraim lived was called Nios, and Nios is extremely rural. There's no electricity, there's no running water, and there's no paved roads for miles. The village is actually split into 2 parts. There's Upper Nios and Lower Nios. Ephraim lived in Upper Nios, right near this big, beautiful lake called Lake Nios, but the majority of villagers lived in Lower Nios, which was below the lake. So that morning, after Ephraim kind of found himself standing outside of his hut for no reason, he began looking around in hopes that other people would be out and about in Upper Nios, where he lived, so he could go talk to them and try to figure out what was wrong with him or, what was going on generally. But as he scanned around Upper Nios, he saw there was not another soul anywhere. He was it. He was the only person walking around. So, without giving it much thought, Ephraim decided he would just start walking down towards Lower Nios to try to talk to someone down there. And so he left his hut and he began walking down the hill that would take him to Lower Nios. After Ephraim got about halfway down this hill, right when he was near Lake Nios, he stopped because suddenly he became totally aware of the fact that the world was totally silent. Normally, the baboons in the nearby forest would be barking and insects would be humming and birds would be chirping, but now it was just completely, totally silent. Even the mosquitoes that were a totally annoying constant in Ephraim's life were gone. It was like the entire world had just shut down. And as Ephraim is looking around, wondering what is going on here, he hears off to his right, over near the lake, a woman shrieking at the top of her lungs. And so Ephraim whipped his head in the direction the screams were coming from, and he saw there was this woman about 100 feet away. She was a local, and she was looking right at Ephraim, and she was barely dressed, and she was ripping the rest of her clothes off, and she was just screaming. And so, acting on instinct, Ephraim immediately turned and just started running towards this woman. And as he's bounding towards her, getting closer and closer, he's starting to notice there's these strange shapes on the ground kind of near this woman. But as he was staring at them, he just couldn't quite place what they were. But when he got about 20 feet away from this shrieking woman, he stopped again, because he realized the shapes on the ground were this woman's entire family. They were all just laying on the ground as if they were sleeping. And near them was all of their cattle, also just laying on the ground as if they were sleeping. But as Ephraim stared at each of these people and each of these animals on the ground, he saw there was some blood around their noses and their mouths, and he realized no person who's sleeping would be that still. These people are all dead. These animals are all dead. And so standing there, Ephraim turned his attention from the bodies back to this woman who had dropped to her knees, and she was grabbing her father's arm and yanking on it and screaming for him to please wake up. But Ephraim could tell there was nothing she could do. Everyone was gone. And Ephraim knew somewhere deep down that, he's supposed to go over and help this woman or console her. But suddenly this wave of fear came over him, the combination of having no idea what's going on, his mind really wasn't working still, and now seeing all these dead people, it was like he just couldn't handle it. And so even though he felt terrible about this, Ephraim took one last look at this very distraught woman and her deceased family, and he turned and he ran away. And when he got back to the main trail, he continued downhill in the direction of Lower Nios. The villagers in Lower Nios lived in these tiny huts with tin roofs that were closely grouped together, and usually, even early in the morning, Lower Nios was a very happy and lively place with kids running around and animals walking in the road and music playing. But as Ephraim came down the hill and was within earshot of Lower Nios, it was deadly silent. And so with panic starting to rise inside of Ephraim, he began to run at full speed, hoping that when he turned the corner and looked down the main road of Lower Nios, he would see the people he was hoping he would see. But when he turned the corner and looked down Main Street, all he saw were dead animals everywhere. They completely covered the streets, the sidewalk, everything. And so at this point, Ephraim was so desperate to see another person that he kept his eyes looking straight ahead so as not to look at all the dead animals, and just ran straight into Lower Nios, and he turned towards the first hut he saw, and he ripped the door open and he stepped inside, and as soon as he did, he just stopped. Because on the ground right in front of him was a woman who was very clearly deceased, just laying in the middle of the floor. She had a bowl of corn right near her hand as if she had been eating and then just fell dead. And so Ephraim, he's staring at this dead woman, and then he looks up and he realizes the bedroom is right in eyesight, and he can see her family in their beds. And at first, Ephraim thought, oh, they're sleeping. But then, as he continued to stare through the doorway into this room, he saw none of them were moving. Their chests were not going up and down from breathing. Her whole family, they were dead too. At this, Ephraim kind of stumbled backwards out of the hut, and then he turned around to face the road he had just been on with all the animals. And when he saw the road again, it was like a piece of his brain started working properly again, because he realized those weren't animal bodies. All those bodies he saw when he came in, those were people. Yes, there were some animals, but most of them were people. He could see people slumped on top of each other, kind of piled up in doorways. He saw one person who was on his motorcycle in the middle of the road, just slumped over his handlebars. And many of the bodies were either naked or partially clothed, with piles of clothing next to them, as if they had been trying to rip their clothes off as fast as they could, like the woman up at the lake had been doing. And as Ephraim looked around in horror, he also realized that there were no markings or cuts or wounds on any of these people. It was like they were just going about their lives when suddenly they died. And so without anything else to do, Ephraim just continued to walk in the direction he had come into the village, hoping that if he kept on going, he might run into someone who was alive. And so he begins walking down the road, he's stepping over bodies, he has no idea what to make of this, and then way down the road, up ahead, he sees there are two people coming towards him. There's a man and what looks like his son, and they're jogging down the road, stumbling over bodies, running towards Ephraim. And so Ephraim stops, expecting these people are going to stop and talk to him. But as these two people got closer, Ephraim saw both of them, the father and the son, their eyes were wide and they were looking straight ahead with kind of a distant 1,000-yard stare. And they didn't stop for a second for Ephraim. It was like they didn't even see him. They just kept on running down the road, past all the bodies. Ephraim didn't try to stop them. He just watched as they passed. And then at some point they veered off the road and ran into the forest and disappeared. And it was at this moment that another part of Ephraim's brain seemed to kind of fit into place. Because as he watched this father and son disappear, he suddenly had this memory come flooding back into his mind. And it was a memory of when he was a kid and his grandfather told him a story. And the story was about Nyos villagers a long, long time ago who decided they wanted to cross Lake Nyos from one side to the other. And so their leader magically parted the waters of Lake Nyos, creating a walkway on the lake bed from one side to the other, and the villagers began to walk. And then, about halfway across, a mosquito landed on the leader's shoulder, and when he went to slap the mosquito, he lost control of the waters and they came crashing down and drowned all of them. Ephraim's grandfather told Ephraim that the ghosts of these drowned villagers now resided between these two big rocks located near Lower Nyos. And so growing up, Ephraim, along with many other people in this village, believed that because of these ghosts, Lower Nyos must be haunted. And in fact, that was actually why Ephraim built his house in Upper Nyos, to avoid these ghosts. And so now, as this memory of hearing this story from his grandfather has come flooding back to Ephraim, he thinks to himself, of course, all of this is the work of those ghosts. And so fearing he would be attacked next, Ephraim turned and just continued running down the road, dodging bodies as he went. And as he ran along, periodically he would stop at various tin huts and he would fling the door open in hopes he would find some survivors. But each time he went inside, everybody in there would be dead, lying in their beds or sitting in chairs or lying on the ground. But after running for quite a while, Ephraim turned to go into yet another hut, and right as he reached for the door opened on its own. And standing in front of him was the owner of this hut. His name was Joseph Nequain, and he was in much worse shape than Ephraim. The night before, Joseph had been inside of his hut when suddenly outside he heard that very loud booming sound that sounded like thunder to Ephraim. And then after hearing the sound, Joseph heard his daughter in her bed making this terrible snoring sound. And so instinctively, Joseph turned to walk over to his daughter to make sure she was okay, but he only got a few steps before he collapsed to the ground. He had woken up that morning with cuts all over his arms from where he fell, and he was also totally exhausted and very confused like Ephraim, and so he managed to drag himself over to his daughter's bed, and he pulled himself up onto her bed, and when he got up there, he realized his daughter was deceased. And so now Joseph has opened the door and he's looking out, and there's all these dead people everywhere, and Ephraim is looking back at him, and Joseph just can't process anything. He's just standing there in a total daze, and Ephraim, he wanted to say something, but no words could come out. And so he too just stood there looking at Joseph. And the two men just stood there right on the threshold of this hut, staring at each other, saying nothing for several minutes, until finally they both just extended their hands and shook silently. And then Ephraim turned around and ran back into the road. And so Joseph at first followed Ephraim kind of out of instinct, but very quickly he veered off from Ephraim, and Joseph went into his neighbor's hut to see if they were okay. But when he opened the door and went inside, he saw all of his neighbors were deceased. But Joseph, he barely reacted to this. It was like he was so numb to what was going on, he just couldn't process it. But after seeing all of his neighbors dead, somewhere deep down inside of his consciousness, Joseph knew he had to go find help. That was his mission. And so he left his neighbor's hut, he ran back to his own hut, he climbed onto his motorcycle, and he started to drive. It took Joseph a long time to drive to the next closest village, but when he got there, there were people, and they were all alive. And so Joseph tried to tell them what had happened in his village, but Joseph just had such a hard time putting his thoughts together that his sentences just didn't make sense. He was kind of incoherent. And then when he did make sense, the things he was talking about, an entire village just suddenly dying, sounded crazy. And so nobody at this other village took Joseph seriously. And so that day, nobody from this other village went to Nios to see what was going on. But the next day, people from this other village did go to Nios. And when they got there, it was exactly as Joseph had said. The whole village was dead. And as authorities would soon find out, it was not just Nios that was affected by this tragic event. Several villages not far from Nios had also suffered mass casualty events on the morning of August 22nd, 1986. And soon, news of these strange mass death events in West Africa were making the news all over the world. And so on August 25th, 3 days after this terrible event, an American scientist named Joseph Devine turned on his TV and saw the news coming out of West Africa. The newscasters were totally baffled about how this could have happened, and no one can figure out what killed these people. And Devine is just staring at his TV in shock, and then he turns, runs to his phone, and he calls his contact at the US government and told them, "You gotta send me to Nios." And because his contact knew Devine's background, he immediately said, "Yes, I'll get you on a flight as soon as we can." Devine and his scientific partner, Haraldur Sigurdsson, arrived in Nios 2 days later on August 27th. When they got there, they saw the military was burying the dead in these huge mass graves, and looking on were the few survivors of this event, like Joseph and Ephraim. Along with Ephraim's family, they also survived, as well as other villagers who had come to see what happened. And so as Devine and Sigurdsson kind of maneuver their way through this crowd of very solemn people, they heard them talking about what they thought happened to all these people. And the theories ranged from secret governmental experiments to invisible superweapons to even atomic explosions. Others, like Ephraim, believed this was paranormal, that those ghosts from the drowned villagers had attacked the village. But Devine and Sigurdsson were reasonably sure that none of those theories were correct. They felt like they did know what actually happened because they had actually witnessed a tragedy like this before, but on a much smaller scale. 2 years earlier, and 60 miles south of Nios, in an area called Lake Manoon, 37 people suddenly dropped dead. And Devine and Sigurdsson had been sent out there to try to figure out what happened to these people, and after lots of experimentation, they came up with a theory that explained what happened, and they called it unknown unnatural hazard. They tried to warn people in the area that this could happen again, and in fact, Sigurdsson had written an entire scientific paper about this theory and submitted it to a prestigious science journal, but nobody took Devine or Sigurdsson seriously. What they were proposing sounded made up, it sounded preposterous. But now, in Nios, it looked very much like their unknown unnatural hazard had happened again. Devine and Sigurdsson would leave the group of people watching this mass burying take place, and they would make their way up the hill to Lake Nios, where they would immediately get to work taking water samples from deep inside the lake. And after capping these samples, the lids began popping off. And that was the moment that Devine and Sigurdsson knew their unknown unnatural hazard theory had to be correct. Lake Nios is not your typical lake. It is a crater lake, which means it sits inside of a volcanic crater, which is a big, deep, bowl-like pit that was formed from a past volcanic explosion. And because of this volcanic activity, there is carbon dioxide in Lake Nyos. A lot of carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide, or CO2 for short, is an odorless, invisible gas that we actually breathe out when we exhale. Now, if you inhale a little bit of CO2, that won't hurt you. If you inhale a little bit more, like a medium amount of CO2, you could feel dizzy and nauseous, your skin will start to feel like it's on fire, you'll have rapid breathing. It'll be horrible, but you'll most likely survive if you stop breathing CO2. And if you breathe in a ton of CO2, you're dead. The CO2 in Lake Nyos had been trapped at the bottom of the lake for as long as anyone knew. But on the night of August 21st, 1986, something happened that caused that trapped gas to be released. Now remember, on that night, August 21st, Ephraim recalled hearing what he thought was thunder outside, and also Joseph would recall hearing a loud booming sound that night. Now, we don't know exactly what that sound was, but it's safe to say that that noise, whatever it was connected to releasing the gas. Maybe it was the sound of a rock slide and big rocks plummeted into the lake and hit the lake bottom and freed the gas that way. Or maybe it was just an actual volcanic eruption inside of the lake. Whatever it was, when the CO2 was freed, it bubbled to the top like it bubbled and popped off the lids of their sample tubes, and when it reached the top of the water, it kind of formed a cloud above the lake. Now, we can't see the cloud, but you can imagine a big cloud, and then this toxic CO2 cloud kind of rolled its way down the hill towards Lower Nyos and other villages in the area. And when this big toxic cloud began coming in contact with people, with animals, and insects, virtually all of them died. As for the few who survived, like Ephraim and his family and Joseph, they were left feeling horribly confused, disoriented, nauseous, totally dizzy from CO2 poisoning. But when they finally were able to get away from Nyos and breathe fresh air, the effects of CO2 poisoning wore off and they were okay. This deadly CO2 phenomenon was exactly what happened on a much smaller scale 2 years earlier at Lake Manoon. It was the unknown, unnatural hazard that Devine and Sigurdsson had tried to warn people about. The official death toll of the Lake Nyos disaster was more than 1,700 people and more than 3,500 livestock, although exact numbers will likely never be known. Today, people have moved back into Upper and Lower Nyos, including Ephraim, despite the fact that authorities have said that lake is still very dangerous and another unknown unnatural hazard, aka a CO2 disaster, could absolutely happen again.
Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballin podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out the rest of our studio's podcasts, Mr. Ballin's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, and Run Fool. Just search for Ballin Studios wherever you get your podcasts. To watch hundreds more stories just like these, head to our YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballin. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya.
Early in the morning of October 3rd, 1994, a woman living in Eugene, Oregon, woke up in her first-floor bedroom to the sound of screaming coming from somewhere on the other side of her house. She thought the noise must be coming from her TV set in the living room, but as she stepped into the hallway, she realized that could not be the case. The screaming was so loud, it was definitely a real person, and it appeared to be coming from her garage. So, even though she was terrified, she ran down the hall, across the living room, over to the door that led into the garage, and she flung it open. Seconds later, this woman would be living her worst nightmare.
But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, please take the Amazon Music follow button out to the movies, but talk the entire way through the film. Okay, let's get into today's story. On a night in late September of 1994, 18-year-old Aaron Itura sat at the very front of a packed meeting room in a community center in Eugene, Oregon, staring out at the crowd of mostly teenagers. The fold-out metal chair Aaron was sitting on was too small for his 6'5", 230-pound frame, so he shifted back and forth to try to get comfortable. Some of the kids sitting out in the audience looked excited to be there, and others looked nervous. But the only people in the crowd that really stood out to Aaron were the young men sitting in a cluster right off to the side of the room. They leaned forward in their chairs, showed off their blue bandanas wrapped around their wrists, and glared at Aaron like they wanted to challenge him to a fight. Over the last year, Aaron had become an important member of an anti-gang task force in Eugene that was led by a woman named Mary Thompson, who was sitting right next to him. And Aaron spent a lot of his free time going with Mary to community centers and high schools in the area to talk about the dangers of gang life, just like he was going to do tonight. The crowds that Aaron and Mary spoke to at these events usually included kids and teenagers who had thought about joining a gang but wanted something better out of life. They also included former gang members who were trying to turn their lives around, and current gang members who had been forced to attend by the state as part of their punishment for a crime they'd committed. But tonight, Aaron knew the cluster of young men glaring at him from the audience didn't fit into any of those groups. These were current gang members who were here by choice. They just wanted to intimidate Mary, Aaron, and the others who had come to speak out against gang life. And he knew, because of their blue bandanas, that they were members of Eugene's most powerful gang, the 74 Hoover Crips, and as far as they were concerned, Aaron was clearly their enemy. In school, Aaron saw members of the 74 Hoover Crips bully kids who they believed were weak and would fight anyone they didn't like, and he saw how the gang spread violence and fear throughout Eugene. At the convenience store where Aaron worked, he'd witnessed knife fights and robberies carried out by gang members, and he knew the gang was tied to much bigger crimes in the city like carjackings, assaults, and drug trafficking. Eugene was a relatively small college town known for its natural beauty, with the Cascade Mountains in the east and the Willamette River winding through the city. But the 74 Hoover Crips had created something ugly amidst those beautiful surroundings. And Aaron wanted to help stop the spread of gang-related crime and violence before it completely overran his beloved hometown. The crowd quieted down as Mary Thompson stood up, stepped forward, and introduced herself. Aaron had seen Mary speak dozens of times, but he was still blown away by how well she commanded a room. That night, she talked about the problems gangs posed in the city and how it was up to people like her and everyone in the audience to turn away from gangs and become a positive force in their community. And most of the audience hung on her every word. But Mary said this meeting was not about her. She believed that teenagers wanted to hear from other teenagers way more than they wanted to hear from a woman who was almost 40 like her. So she thanked everyone for coming and then introduced Aaron. Aaron stood up from his chair, he smiled at Mary, and then took a few steps towards the audience. Even the toughest members of the 74 Hoover Crips in the crowd were taken aback by Aaron's huge size. But Aaron almost always had a smile on his face, and his voice was warm and soft, which was why he was known around school as the, quote, gentle giant. Aaron used his time in front of the group that night to talk about the future. He knew a lot of people in the crowd had made mistakes in the past, but that didn't mean they still couldn't achieve great things. He talked about how gangs could destroy young people's lives and how it was so important to find something positive to be passionate about. Aaron explained that his own passion was art. He said he loved to draw, and he worked hard to keep getting better at it, and he said his passion for drawing had led him to apply to art school in New York City, and now, when he graduated from high school, he was going to pursue something he loved and have an adventure on the other side of the country. At the end of Aaron's talk, members of the audience applauded, and Mary beamed as she looked out at the crowd. But as Aaron took his seat, he noticed the cluster of young men with their blue bandanas on their wrists were not clapping. They were still just glaring at him. And when Mary stood up and wrapped up the meeting and said goodnight and told everyone to head out, those young men made sure to wait back and then stare back angrily at Aaron as they were the last to leave the room. Aaron tried not to let their stares bother him, but he couldn't help but feel a little rattled. Clearly, their intimidation technique had worked. But after the audience had left, Mary came over to him and gave him a big hug and said he did a great job, and suddenly Aaron felt a lot better. In the time that he had known Mary, he'd come to see her almost like a second mother. Aaron had a great relationship with his own mother, but he felt like Mary pushed him to be the best version of himself. And he was amazed that someone who had experienced as much heartache as Mary had could still be so positive and give so much of her time to helping others. Mary had become an anti-gang activist because she had personally seen what gangs in Eugene could do to young people and how they could tear families apart. Years earlier, Mary's son, Beau Flynn, had actually been one of the founders of Eugene's infamous 74 Hoover Crips when he was just 13 years old. And under Beau's leadership, the gang had grown, had acquired a sizable stash of guns, and had progressed from small-time robberies to more violent crimes with bigger payoffs. Mary had always been a very protective mother and would do anything for Beau, but she knew she was losing her son to this gang. And so when Beau's gang lifestyle began catching up to him, and he started going in and out of juvenile detention centers, Mary decided to form an anti-gang group to try to prevent other parents from having to experience what she was currently experiencing with her son. Over the past couple of years, Mary's anti-gang group had grown, and she'd quickly become one of the most well-known anti-gang activists in the Pacific Northwest. Through meetings, seminars, and TV appearances, Mary's message reached thousands of people in the region. And for a time, Mary's anti-gang messaging was not just helping the community, it also appeared to be having an impact at home on her son. For the past year, Mary's son, Beau, who was now 16, had been home from his latest stint in a juvenile detention center, and at first, when he got home, it seemed like he was ready to just walk away from gang life, that he understood it was not good for him. And Mary thought that it was not just her own influence that had caused this change in her son, but also it was Aaron's voice that her son had listened to and was now responding to. Aaron had liked Mary's son, Beau, from the moment he met him. And Aaron, who was the oldest of 5 children, treated Beau like another younger sibling who needed to be looked after and protected. The two young men spent lots of time together at Mary's house after school, they hung out on the weekends, and Aaron always did his best to keep Beau out of trouble. And as the boys spent more time together, Mary hoped that Beau would start to think about his future, just like Aaron did. But Beau was not Aaron. And eventually, Beau was just not able to resist the allure of getting back into his gang life. And in mid-September, just weeks before Mary and Aaron's anti-gang meeting with the intimidating young men with bandanas staring at Aaron, Beau had gotten into a knife fight with a rival gang member, and he'd ended up back in a juvenile detention center. Mary was obviously heartbroken, and she now worried that Beau might never get to come home again. In the weeks following the knife attack by Beau and the anti-gang meeting that Aaron and Mary had run, Aaron continued to work with Mary to organize other events for the anti-gang group, but he also thought it was important to focus on the things he personally really loved in his life, like his artwork, his family, and his girlfriend. Aaron had been dating 22-year-old Carrie Barkley for a little over 4 months, and both of them were convinced the other was the love of their life. Their relationship had gotten serious very quickly, and so Carrie regularly spent the night at Aaron's house. In fact, she was there so often that Aaron's mother had begun to view Carrie less as Aaron's girlfriend and more as her daughter-in-law. At 10 p.m. on Sunday, October 2nd, so a few weeks after Beau's knife attack and Aaron and Mary's anti-gang meeting, Aaron and Carrie were relaxing on the couch inside of Aaron's home, watching TV and talking. Aaron sat with his arm wrapped around Carrie's shoulders, and Carrie, who was already dressed for bed in a white t-shirt and pajama pants, was curled up tightly right next to him. And as they sat there enjoying the night, the landline phone in Aaron's house suddenly started ringing. And immediately, Aaron leapt up off the couch and rushed to go answer it. But before he could, he heard the oldest of his sisters pick up the phone in her bedroom. So Aaron turned around and sat back down on the couch next to Carrie and put his arm back around her and kept watching TV. But almost as soon as he'd sat down, his sister, who had just answered the phone, walked into the living room. She said the person on the phone had asked for Aaron, but when she told the caller she'd go get him, the caller had hung up. Aaron told his sister not to worry about it, but when she left the room, a look of concern came across Aaron's face. He didn't know why someone would call him so late on a Sunday night just to hang up. But when Carrie, who could now see the look of concern on Aaron's face, asked Aaron what was wrong, he said, "Oh, everything's fine. Whoever called must have just realized they didn't actually need to talk to me, and so that's why they hung up." Carrie shrugged, and then the two of them settled back down on the couch and watched TV and talked for a few more hours. Then finally, at around midnight, Carrie said she was tired, so they decided to go to bed. After turning off the TV, Aaron and Carrie got up and walked across the first floor of the house to the door that led into the garage. Aaron had built a makeshift bedroom inside of the garage. It was like a little cubicle in the corner with a sheetrock wall and a wooden door for privacy. And so Aaron and Carrie walked into the garage and made their way over to Aaron's bedroom door. They opened it up and stepped inside. The room was very small, with 2 mattresses piled up on the floor, and on the walls were posters of some of Aaron's favorite bands and movies, along with some of his own drawings and a few beer ads featuring scantily clad women. There were also empty pizza boxes and fast food bags on the floor because Aaron and Carrie often ate in this room by themselves, and neither of them really liked to clean up. Carrie climbed onto the mattresses, slid over to her side of the bed furthest from the door, and got under the covers. Then Aaron took off his shirt and jeans, got into bed next to her, gave her a kiss, and then soon after that, they both drifted off to sleep. About an hour later, at around 1:30 a.m., Aaron's mother, who was asleep in her first-floor bedroom, woke up suddenly to the sound of screaming. As she sat up in bed, she thought the sounds were coming from the TV in the living room, that maybe Aaron and Carrie had left it on. But when she stepped out into the hallway, she could tell right away the screaming was not coming from the TV. It was coming from a real person, likely inside of the garage. Aaron's mom sprinted down the hallway through the living room to the door that led into the garage, and then once she was in the garage, she could tell the screaming was coming from Carrie, who was still inside of Aaron's actual little bedroom. So Aaron's mother rushed over to the door, she flung it open, and when she saw what was inside, she began screaming too. And then eventually she turned around and ran back into the house and dialed 911. A couple hours later, at almost 4 a.m., Detective Jim Michaud of the Violent Crime Squad of the Eugene Department of Public Safety drove his 1993 Ford Taurus down a quiet, tree-lined street towards Aaron's house. When Detective Michaud pulled up to the modest 2-story split-level house with a 2-car garage in front, he saw red and blue flashing lights from the police cruisers parked outside and yellow crime scene tape strung across the front of the house. Michaud thought a scene like this seemed so out of place in such a quiet and safe neighborhood. After parking, Michaud stepped out of his car and breathed in the crisp morning fall air. He was a veteran in law enforcement and an experienced lead detective, but there was something about receiving calls in the dead of night that still put him on edge. But at least he knew what he was about to walk into. He'd been informed that an 18-year-old male named Aaron Itura had been found shot in his bedroom and that he had been rushed to the hospital. Michaud had also been told that there was no sign of forced entry and that the victim's girlfriend had been found in bed with him, but completely unharmed. And Michaud knew that in a situation like this, the girlfriend was usually the most obvious suspect. So Michaud walked up to the house where he was greeted by the officers who were already on the scene. Those officers led him inside the house where he saw Carrie sitting on the living room couch with Aaron's mother and his oldest sister. All 3 women were still in the clothes they'd been sleeping in, and they were crying and holding each other. But before Michaud could talk to them, he needed to see the crime scene. So he walked past the women and followed the officers out to the garage and into Aaron's makeshift bedroom. And when he stepped into that bedroom, he saw a pool of blood on one of the pillows as well as blood spatter on the walls. After Michaud had studied the room for a few moments, he turned and headed back into the main house. And when he did, crime scene techs filtered back into the garage bedroom to take more photos and take more blood samples. Once Michaud was back in the living room and began approaching the 3 crying women on the couch, one of them, Aaron's mom, lifted her head up, and seeing Michaud walking toward her, she started begging him if she could be allowed to leave and go to the hospital to be with her son. It had been hours since the ambulance had taken him, and she couldn't stand the thought of Aaron lying in a hospital bed alone with nobody who loved him nearby. In a gentle voice, Michaud said he would make sure she got to the hospital as soon as possible, but he needed to do a couple of things before he could let her go. He told Aaron's mom that he was the lead detective on this case and that he had a few questions for all of them. He also said that he would need to run gunpowder residue tests on her, her daughter, and Carrie. A residue test indicates whether or not someone has recently fired a gun. Michaud assured Aaron's mother that this test was standard protocol for shootings, and she said that she understood. As an officer swabbed the women's hands as part of that gunpowder residue test, Michaud took a seat in front of the couch. Then, in a calm, steady voice, he asked them if they had seen or heard anything unusual in the house the previous night. Carrie sat forward and looked around to see if anybody else was going to speak, and then she cleared her throat and began talking. And as she did, Michaud watched her closely, because as of right now, she was his primary suspect. As Carrie spoke with a shaky voice, she made it clear that she had been asleep in bed with Aaron when she heard this loud noise, and she said when she woke up because of this noise, she saw 2 men with blue bandanas over their faces rushing out of their little bedroom, and then she turned and saw Aaron was bleeding on the bed next to her. Michaud had worked enough violent crime investigations in the area to know that men in blue bandanas almost always meant the same thing, the 74 Hoover Crips. So Michaud asked the women if Aaron had any connections to that gang. And at this, Aaron's mother told him that Aaron was heavily involved in Mary Thompson's anti-gang task force. The idea of gang members carrying out a hit on an anti-gang activist made a lot of sense to Michaud, but there were still a few things about the crime scene that stood out to him. There was no sign of forced entry into the house, and Carrie was left completely unharmed. And in all the gang-style hits that Michaud knew about, the shooters almost always made sure no witnesses were left behind, meaning they killed everyone. Michaud thanked the 3 women for their information and told Aaron's mother and sister that someone from victim services would arrive soon to escort them and the rest of their family to the hospital. Then Michaud turned to Carrie and said that she would actually need to come with him to the station. He explained that because she was literally in the room with Aaron when he was shot, she likely had more information that could really help the police. In reality, Michaud figured that either Carrie was lying about seeing those 2 men in bandanas, or she was telling the truth and he had yet another case of gang violence on his hands. Either way, he needed to question Carrie further. When Michaud and Carrie arrived at the police station, Michaud led her into a small bright room, and then he sat down opposite her across a black wooden table. Carrie pulled a blanket she'd taken from Aaron's house tight across her shoulders, but Michaud could still see spots of blood all over her white t-shirt. And Michaud could also see that she was trembling under the blanket. Michaud began to ask Carrie about her and Aaron's relationship, if there were any problems between them, if they had fought recently. And Carrie would say no, they got along great, they were in love, they didn't fight, nothing. But when Michaud just continued to ask more and more questions about their relationship, Carrie picked up on the idea that she was being looked at as a suspect, and she finally just said, "Shouldn't you be out looking for the 2 men in bandanas that I saw? Why are we still talking about our relationship?" Michaud could sense Carrie's frustration and figured at this point he likely was not going to get very much more information out of her, and so Michaud shifted the conversation to something different and really specific. He said, "Okay, thank you so much for your help, but before you go, do you remember if you noticed anything missing from the bedroom? Did these 2 men wearing bandanas steal anything?" At first, Carrie said she couldn't think of anything, But then she remembered and she said, actually, yes, a pack of cigarettes was missing from her purse. Michaud thought this was an odd thing for someone to steal during a shooting, but he didn't bring that up. Instead, he just thanked Carrie for her time and said someone would be there soon to take her home. Then he got up from the table, headed out of the room, and walked outside to his car. He held up his hand to shield his eyes from the morning sun. He was tired, but he knew he still had a long way to go before he could rest. A few hours later, at around 10:30 a.m., Aaron's mother and Aaron's siblings were by Aaron's bedside at the hospital. As the machines that were keeping Aaron alive buzzed and beeped, Aaron's mother wiped the tears from her eyes and leaned in close to her son's ear. She whispered to him that she loved him and that he was the strongest person she ever knew, then she kissed him on his forehead. 15 minutes later, Aaron's brain activity ceased and he passed away. As doctors and nurses began coming into the room, Aaron's mother stepped back away from the bed and clung on to her other children who were crying in her arms. She had always said her family was like a wheel, and Aaron was the spoke that held it all together. Now he was gone, and she had no idea how she would keep living without him. A few hours after Aaron died, Detective Michaud parked his car outside of a house located only a few miles away from Aaron's house. Michaud had just learned that Aaron's mother, sister, and Carrie had all tested negative for gunpowder residue, which meant none of them had recently fired a gun, and therefore very likely were not involved in Aaron's murder. And so, after receiving these results, Michaud believed that Carrie must have been telling the truth about the two men in bandanas she'd seen in Aaron's bedroom. And so, Michaud thought that a gang-style hit now seemed like the strongest possibility for what happened. So now, he wanted to talk to the person who knew more about Aaron's anti-gang activities than anyone else, Mary Thompson, Aaron's mentor and leader of the anti-gang task force. Michaud got out of his car and walked up to Mary's front door and knocked. A moment later, the door swung open, and Mary quickly ushered Michaud inside to the kitchen, where they both sat down. Mary said she could not believe what happened to Aaron. He had been such a positive influence on young people in Eugene, and he'd been such a vital part of her anti-gang work. And with her son Beau already locked away, she told Michaud losing Aaron felt like she'd lost another son. Michaud felt bad for Mary, but he knew he had to ask her some pretty difficult questions, so instead of trying to make small talk, he just looked her in the eyes and said, "Mary, do you think Beau had anything to do with Aaron's death?" Remember, her son Beau was a founding member of the 74 Hoover Crips, which Michaud believes were involved in Aaron's death. Mary immediately shook off the idea that Beau could have had anything to do with Aaron's murder, but after she said this, she stood up and began pacing around the room. Michaud noticed her somewhat anxious behavior and asked her, how can you be so sure Beau was innocent? And Mary would say, well, for one, Beau and Aaron were really close, and two, Beau is in a juvenile detention center and has been for weeks and was when Aaron was killed, so he couldn't have done this. Michaud nodded like he agreed with her, but in truth, Michaud knew that it was entirely possible for crimes to be committed or at least masterminded from behind bars, especially when gangs were involved. And Michaud also knew mothers would often say anything to protect their sons, even if their son was clearly a gang member and she was clearly an anti-gang activist. So Michaud ultimately thanked Mary for her time and information and just asked her to please let police know if she thought of anything that might help with their investigation, and she said she would. Over the next few days, Michaud tried to question known members of the 74 Hoover Crips, but none of them were willing to talk to him because he was police. But on October 6th, so 3 days after Aaron's murder, Mary reached out to Michaud and gave him a huge tip. Mary's anti-gang work put her in contact with a lot of young people who were trying to get out of the gang life. But some of them still had connections to the 74 Hoover Crips, and she called police to tell them that some of those kids she worked with said they knew who had killed Aaron because the killers were bragging about it at school. Jim Elstad and Joe Brown were two teenage boys who had gone to school with Aaron and one of his sisters for years. At one time, they had all been friends, but recently, Jim and Joe had gotten heavily involved with the 74 Hoover Crips, and now they were being overheard bragging that they had shown their worth to the gang by killing one of the loudest anti-gang activists in Oregon, Aaron. Police tracked Jim and Joe down at their houses and brought them in for questioning. Michaud met with them in a small room similar to the one where he'd questioned Carrie. The fluorescent lights were bright and buzzing overhead. Michaud sat down across from them at a table and just stared at them for a minute. They were both average height or shorter, and neither of them looked like they weighed more than 150 pounds. As he stared at them, he was sure they never would have had the guts to try to take on the 6'5", 230-pound Aaron if they didn't have a gun with them. Michaud eventually leaned back in his chair and then calmly said that he had heard they had been bragging at school about being the ones who'd killed the big guy. And Jim and Joe just grinned and said, yes, they were the ones who'd murdered Aaron. Michaud stared at them in shock. He'd just spent days dealing with other gang members who wouldn't say a word to him, and now these two boys weren't trying to hide their gang affiliations or their crime at all. What was going on? And so Michaud sat forward and asked them, okay, well, why'd you do it? And they said Aaron and his anti-gang activities were one of the main reasons police were paying so much attention to their gang, and they figured if they could take Aaron down, they could help bring down the entire anti-gang task force. Michaud could not believe how forthcoming they were being, so he just continued asking questions. He asked the boys to explain exactly how they killed Aaron, and again, without any hesitation, Jim and Joe told him. And the story they told matched up with the evidence police found in Aaron's bedroom, and it matched up with Carrie's story of what she saw on the night of the murder. Jim and Joe also told Michaud that after they shot Aaron and rushed out of his garage, they drove to the river and threw the gun in the water. And when they said this, Michaud remembered that earlier that day, a fisherman had turned in a gun he had retrieved in the water, and while police were still running tests on this gun to figure out if it was the murder weapon in Aaron's case, Michaud now understood that very likely it was. It was Jim and Joe's gun. After Jim and Joe told Michaud everything, Michaud arrested them for Aaron's murder. But while the rest of the police department began congratulating Michaud on getting the case solved so quickly, Michaud couldn't help but feel like something was off. This was too easy. Jim and Joe had said they killed Aaron to reduce attention on the 74 Hoover Crips, but killing a well-known anti-gang activist who was beloved in the community seemed like a surefire way to do the opposite of that. So why in the world would the 74 Hoover Crips do something like this? Who would sign off on this? It all just seemed totally backwards. And it would turn out Michaud was right in thinking that this case was not quite solved yet, because Aaron's mother would receive a very strange phone call not long after Joe and Jim were arrested, and when she told Michaud about this strange phone call, it would send Michaud down a path he never expected to go down. Based on that strange phone call Aaron's mother received, and evidence gathered and interviews conducted during the investigation, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Aaron Itorra in the very early hours of October 3rd, 1994. At 10 p.m. on October 2nd, a teenage girl sat in her bedroom. She stared at the swirling smoke and smelled the marijuana burning from the joint she held in her hand. With her other hand, she grabbed her phone and dialed a number. On the other end, she heard Aaron's sister answer. The girl asked the sister if Aaron was home, and as soon as Aaron's sister had said yes and that she'd go and get him, the caller hung up the phone. That was all the info she needed. The girl took another long, slow drag on the joint to calm her nerves, then she picked up the phone again and dialed another number. It was the number to the leader of the 74 Hoover Crips. When the gang leader answered, the girl took a deep breath, then she said Aaron was home. The gang leader told the girl she'd done a good job and then hung up. After that, the gang leader called a young man and told him that everything was in place and that tonight was the night. Hours later, at around 1 a.m. on October 3rd, two young men dressed in black with blue bandanas covering their faces walked down the street towards Aaron's house. The streetlights were bright, so they moved fast and tried to stay in the shadows. One of them clutched a .45 caliber Smith & Wesson revolver in his hand. When they reached Aaron's house, they stopped on the street out in front of it and just stared. All of the lights inside were off, and so the two young men hoped that this meant everyone inside was asleep. As they stared at the garage door that they knew led to Aaron's room, they both wondered if maybe they were going too far. But they knew if they didn't go through with this, they would be in trouble with the leader of their gang, and that was the last thing either of them wanted. So they eventually just nodded to each other and then walked up to the garage door. The garage door was not locked, so they crouched down and just slowly raised it up, trying to make as little noise as possible. And once they were inside the garage, they walked over to the corner where Aaron's makeshift bedroom was. They opened the door, and right away they could see Aaron and Carrie sleeping in the bed. The young man who had the gun in his hand stayed by the door, getting the courage up to fire the gun, while the other young man crept forward and grabbed Carrie's purse, which was lying on the ground next to the bed. And after looking through it, he found a pack of cigarettes, pulled them out, and held them up to his partner standing by the door with the gun, like he was holding up his prize, and then after tucking the cigarettes into his pocket, he made his way back to the door. And at this point, the young man with the gun finally had the courage up, and he stepped forward till he was right next to the bed, and he held the gun out and looked straight down at Aaron. Aaron was sleeping on his side, with his face looking away from the gunman at Carrie. Then the gunman took several short breaths, made sure he was aiming his revolver point blank at the back of Aaron's head, and then he fired. As the two young men turned and ran out of the bedroom, Carrie was already sitting up and screaming. So the two men just continued running out of the garage, out onto the street, down the road to their car. They hopped inside, they fired it on, peeled out, and sped off down the street. When the two young men got out of Aaron's neighborhood, they started laughing and shouting with excitement. Then they pulled down their blue bandanas, and both of them let out a huge sigh of relief. Jim and Joe were these two young men. They really had murdered Aaron just like they had confessed to. But they had left out a crucial detail to their confession, which was who told them to kill Aaron. Not long after speeding away from Aaron's house, Jim and Joe arrived outside of a new location, another house. Once they scanned behind them to make sure no one had followed them, they hopped out of the car and made their way up to the front door of this house and knocked. Within seconds, the door had swung open, and standing in front of them was the leader of the 74 Hoover Crips. She looked at them with a neutral expression, then scanned behind them to make sure they were alone, and then she told them to come inside. It would turn out the real leader of the 74 Hoover Crips was not Bo. It was his mother, Mary Thompson, one of the leading anti-gang activists in the Pacific Northwest. She used her position as a mentor in the community not to try to scare young people away from gang life, but instead to actively recruit them for her gang. And for a long time, this setup had worked out great. Until recently, when her son, who really was a founder of the 74 Hoover Crips, Bo, got arrested for attacking a man with a knife. And while there were lots of witnesses to this attack, only one person was prepared to actually testify in court, and that person was Aaron. Because Aaron was actually an anti-gang activist, even if it was awkward that he was testifying against Bo, the son of the person he worked with. And as Bo's trial approached, Mary decided Aaron just needed to be silenced, so she ordered his execution. When Jim and Joe confessed to killing Aaron, they never gave Mary away. They took the fall completely for the killing. But for reasons no one understands, 3 days after the murder, Mary herself decided to call Aaron's mother. And on this phone call, she says to Aaron's mother, if Aaron had just kept his mouth shut, none of this would have happened. Aaron's mother was floored by this statement, and so she immediately called Michaud, who also thought Mary's comment was totally out of place, and soon after, he arranged for a wiretap of Mary's phones, and quickly the full extent of her involvement in citywide gang activity and the role she played in Aaron's murder became clear. Mary was ultimately found guilty of aggravated murder and sentenced to life in prison. But due to a legal technicality, her sentence was reduced and she was released after serving only 23 years. Before his death, Aaron had become an organ donor, and after his death, 5 people received his organs and their lives were saved because of Aaron. Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballin Podcast. If you enjoyed today's story, be sure to check out our YouTube channel, just called Mr. Ballin, where we have literally hundreds more stories just like this one, but many of those stories are only available on YouTube. So go check it out, Mr. Ballin on YouTube. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. In 1988, a waitress who was living in Central Florida had just begun her shift at a local diner when, as she's standing in the middle of the restaurant, her heart just started racing like mad. Now, she had not been running around or doing any heavy lifting, so it didn't make any sense. And so, feeling kind of startled by what was happening, she instinctively just turned around and ran for the bathroom and sat down in a stall, waiting for this heart racing to stop. But as she sat there, her heart only started to beat faster and faster, and then she began to feel tingling in her feet and in her arms. And it was at that moment that she realized she must be having a heart attack. Except she wasn't. Something much, much worse was happening to her. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, please ask the Amazon Music follow button to go out dancing with you, but when you reach the dance floor, repeatedly step on their feet without acknowledging it. Okay, let's get into today's story. Peggy Carr's life had never been very easy. She was born in 1947 in a very small rural town in Central Florida to parents who were deaf and who had almost no money. So from a young age, Peggy had to go to work, except the only jobs she could land were either extremely low paying or they were just outright dangerous, like overnight shifts at isolated truck stops on deserted highways where she would waitress there all by herself. But Peggy never complained about her job prospects. Instead, she just took whatever jobs were available because she knew that she and her family needed the money. And whenever she was working in a dangerous environment, she would intentionally put on this very tough exterior to make sure no one attempted to take advantage of her. And despite her small stature, she quickly developed a reputation amongst her coworkers as somebody you did not want to mess with. Peggy didn't take crap from anybody. But while this kind of prickly outer shell protected her from potential predators, it also warded off potential romantic partners that might have been interested in her, but were kind of intimidated when they interacted with her. But eventually, one man would cut through Peggy's defenses, and they would fall in love, and they would get married, and they would have 3 kids together, and everything was great until it wasn't. The marriage would crash and burn, and so by the mid-1980s, Peggy was a mid-30-somethings divorced mother of 3 teenage children who had to work overtime at a local diner just to barely make ends meet. And while she still acted very tough and composed when she was working or when she was out in public, when she was behind closed doors at her home with her kids, they saw the real side of Peggy. And that side was just kind of sad. I mean, life had just been kind of hard on her, and she had tried so hard to provide a safe and happy home for her kids, and she felt like she had kind of let them down. But her kids, on the other hand, were not bitter towards their mother for the divorce. It just pained them to see her so upset. And so her kids really hoped that one day their mom would meet somebody new, she would fall in love all over again, and maybe that would put a smile back on her face. And in late 1987, that is exactly what happened. That year, Peggy met a man named Perry Ellen Carr. Perry Ellen, who just went by his nickname, Pie, was a lot like Peggy. He was a recently divorced single father of 2 teenage children. He didn't take crap from anyone, and like Peggy, he had been kind of forced to start working at a fairly young age. When Peggy met him, he was living with his 2 kids in another tiny Central Floridian rural town called Alturas, and he was the foreman of a local phosphate mining company there. Phosphate is a chemical that has a number of industrial and consumer uses. So Peggy and Pi, they start dating, and right away, Peggy's kids notice this huge shift in their mother. I mean, now she's all smiles, she's so happy. It seems like Pi is the knight in shining armor that's come to save the day. And then, just a couple of months later, in April of 1988, Pi and Peggy would get married, much to their children's excitement. And then after the marriage was finalized, Peggy and her 3 kids moved in with Pi and his 2 kids in his home in Alturas, Florida. And for a while, this newly blended family worked out perfectly, even though they were living in a fairly small house. And so all 5 of them were kind of all over each other, but they got along great. And it was kind of fun to have so many people in this house all the time. It was kind of crazy and hectic, and overall the house just felt like it was bursting with life. But within a few months of Peggy and her kids moving in with Pi and his kids, Peggy and Pi started to have marital issues. It was like all their early chemistry had just totally vanished, and in its place was nothing. They basically completely resented each other, and everything they did upset the other person. And then, adding fuel to the fire, were rumors that began spreading around this small town where everybody knows each other, that Pi was apparently back together with an ex-girlfriend, and so he was having an affair. And so Pi, he denied these accusations, but Debbie totally believed them. And so their fights got worse and worse and worse, and the more they fought, the more a wedge was kind of driven down the center of this blended family, where Peggy's kids automatically took their mother's side, and Pi's kids automatically took their dad's side. And so from the outside looking in, it seemed plainly obvious that Pi and Peggy's marriage was not going to last. But before their marriage could fall apart, something totally unexpected happened that would link these 2 families together forever. In late October of 1988, so 7 months into Peggy and Pi's now very rocky marriage, Pi suddenly got up one morning and just told Peggy he was leaving for the whole day to go hunting. This was not a planned trip, he just wanted to get away. And at this point, neither of them wanted to spend any time with each other, so Peggy didn't care. She said, "Go ahead, enjoy your trip, I'll see you later." And so Pi, he leaves the house, he gets in his truck, he drives off, and then a little while later, Peggy and her daughter, Sissy, they both get their things together, and they head out and they get in Peggy's car, and they drive into town. Both Peggy and her daughter worked at the same diner as waitresses, and they both had a shift that morning. And so they arrive at the diner, they both get out, they go inside, they get their things on, and they begin their shift like normal. But not long into the shift, Peggy was about to walk up to one of her tables when she noticed her heart was racing. And she had not been running around the restaurant, she had not done any heavy lifting. There was no reason for her heart to suddenly be beating at a really fast clip. And so initially, Peggy tried to just ignore it, thinking that her heart would slow down and she would go back to normal. But when her racing heart persisted, she walked away from the table she was waiting on and snuck off into the staff bathroom, and she sat in one of the stalls, she shut the door, and she just sat on the toilet waiting for her heart to stop racing. But as she sat there, not only did her heart only continue to thump like mad, but she started to notice her legs were tingling and so were her arms. Now, Peggy was a no-nonsense person. She was not prone to panicking or overreacting or anything like that. And so as she's sitting there feeling these symptoms, it dawns on her that maybe I'm having a heart attack. And so she decides, okay, I'm going to deal with this. She stands up, she opens the stall door, she goes to the sink, she washes her hands, she washes her face, she kind of calms herself down, and then she walks out of the bathroom, she goes right into the staff break room, and she tells her daughter, I think I'm having a heart attack, but don't worry, I'm just going to go home, I'm going to lay down. If this gets worse, I will go to the hospital, but for right now, I don't really know what it is, but I want to take it seriously, so I'm going to leave for the day. And so Sissy is looking at her mom, really concerned, but Sissy knows what her mom is like. Her mom is tough as nails. She is the type of person that's going to sleep off a heart attack. And so she says to her mom, okay, go home. I'll be sure to check on you as soon as I get back, and please call me if anything changes. And so Peggy, whose heart was still racing and her arms and her legs were still tingling, she told her daughter, everything's going to be fine. And then she told her manager that she was leaving. And then Peggy slipped out the back door. She got in her car and she drove back home. When she got there, the house was empty, so she just went inside, she made her way to her bedroom, and she lied down in her bed to try to get some rest. That afternoon, Peggy's son, Dwayne, came home from high school, and when he walked inside, he found his mother laying down in her bed. This was very unusual for Dwayne, because his mother never took naps. In fact, he could not recall a time ever that he saw his mom napping, even when she was sick.
And so concerned, he went into her bedroom and she was facing away from him. And so he kind of jostled her awake. And when his mom rolled over to face him, her face was pale. She was sweating. She obviously had not been sleeping. She was gritting her teeth and it looked like she was in a lot of pain or some sort of discomfort. And he said, "Mom, geez, are you okay?" And she would say to him, "Oh, no, I'm fine. I'm just sleeping something off. I got something going on. I think I have a flu or something. I don't know. I took off from work, so I'm just sleeping it off." And so Dwayne, he knows his mom is tough as nails. And if she says she's going to sleep something off, then she'll be just fine. And so Dwayne said, "Okay, well, let me know if you need anything." And so Dwayne began to walk away, but his mother would actually flag him back and she would level with him and she would tell him that actually something is wrong here. I feel like someone has poured fire down my veins in my arms and in my legs, and it is excruciatingly painful. And so Dwayne is hearing his mother say this, and he knows his mother is not the type of person to complain or exaggerate or anything. She is just straight no nonsense. And so for her to say this is the most excruciating pain she's ever been in, and she's laying in bed unable to move, he knew this was really serious. And so Dwayne began telling his mom that you got to go to the hospital. We need to get Pi here to drive you to the hospital, or we need to call an ambulance, but something needs to be done here. But despite the pain she was in, Peggy was still a little bit reserved about it. She thought maybe she could just sleep it off. But as they're having this kind of back and forth about what to do, Pi would return from his hunting trip. He would come in the house, and right away Dwayne would run over to him. He would explain to Pi, "Hey, this is not normal. My mom never ever acts this way. She never complains. This is really serious. You gotta take her to the hospital." But Pi would actually say, "Nah, she's fine. I'm sure she just has a fever or maybe the flu. She'll sleep it off." But when he walked into the bedroom and he saw his wife looking so horrible and literally squirming in pain, he relented and said, "Okay, I'll take her to the hospital." And so Pi would have to literally carry Peggy out of the house, put her in his truck. He drove her to the hospital and then had to carry her into the hospital. And by the time Peggy was under doctor's care at the hospital, she no longer could talk. She was just moaning in agony from this excruciating pain in her limbs, and her heart was still racing, and she was nauseous, and she was vomiting. She was really spiraling quickly. And so after she's been admitted, the doctors turned to Pi and to Dwayne and to Sissy and to the other family members that had assembled, and they asked them, "Do you have any idea what could have caused this?" And they all said, "No, she just suddenly started feeling this way." And so the doctors, who were unable to ask Peggy, she was in such blinding pain she couldn't even talk, they just began running her through a wide-ranging series of tests to try to figure out what was going on. But when these results began coming in, either she was negative for the thing they were testing for, or it just came back that everything was normal. And so they're looking at Peggy, seeing her completely falling apart. None of their tests have revealed anything is wrong with her. And so they're at a loss. They don't know what's wrong with her. And so without a better option, they just put Peggy into a hospital room and begin monitoring her. And sure enough, after being in the hospital for 3 days, Peggy's symptoms would come down. While she wasn't back completely to strength, she was able to speak again, she was able to eat and drink water and move around. She was still very uncomfortable, her heart would still race periodically, and she would get fits of pain in all of her extremities. But overall, she felt like she was really improving. And so after 3 days, she was discharged from the hospital. And so Peggy and her family, they drive back to their home, and initially, everything's okay. It seems like she's on the mend. But within 24 hours, Peggy's heart starts to race again, and before long, her arms and legs feel like they are on fire. Now, Peggy and her family, they know that the doctors don't know what this condition is. And so their immediate reaction was huge concern that Peggy, again, was suffering from this horrible thing. But going to the hospital didn't really feel like the obvious first choice. In fact, the obvious first choice, at least for Peggy, was just to sit at the house and wait it out the same way she had waited it out at the hospital. But over the next several days, despite laying in bed and resting as much as she could, her symptoms did not get any better. They got worse and worse and worse, to the point where she literally was completely bedridden, and all she could do was just shake and periodically scream into her pillow from all the pain she was experiencing in her extremities. And so finally, on October 30th, which was 10 days from the first day that Peggy felt these strange symptoms when she was at the diner, her family decided, you know what, enough is enough. She obviously is not able to just sleep off whatever this is. And so they called an ambulance, which rushed her to the hospital.
And when she got there, the doctors, they remembered her from the week before, so they understood this was a bit of a mystery. But just in case, they ran the exact same battery of tests on her to see if maybe now there was some other indication of what this was. But again, all of the tests came back, and they either came back negative or inconclusive, or just showed that, nothing was wrong with her. The doctors even ran her through some tests for poison, thinking, maybe she accidentally ingested something toxic, and that's what's causing all of this. But those tests as well came back negative. And so totally stumped, the doctors decided the only thing they could do was once again put her in a hospital room and just monitor her. And so that night, Peggy was wheeled into a room, and all night, up and down that hospital wing, people listened to the sound of Peggy screaming at the top of her lungs from the pain she was experiencing. And then the next morning, the whole situation got even worse. Not only for Peggy, who by now was dipping in and out of consciousness, but also for the rest of her family. Because that morning, Peggy's son, Dwayne, and Peggy's stepson, so Pi's son, Travis, they were both admitted to the same hospital for exhibiting these same symptoms as Peggy. Their heart was racing, they were nauseous, they were vomiting, and their arms and legs were starting to tingle. And so the doctors, with nothing else to do, just ran Dwayne and Travis through all the same tests they had put Peggy through, and they all came back negative or they came back normal. However, shortly after Dwayne and Travis had been admitted to the hospital, a neurologist who was looking after Peggy, he noticed something about her condition, and suddenly it was like his medical training from back in college kicked in, and he remembered something very specific that lined up exactly with what he was seeing in Peggy. And he suddenly realized that he knew what was going on. And so he told his colleagues, they ran out and they got this very specialized testing kit that doctors very rarely use. It's only for this one really specific and very rare condition. And they tested Dwayne and Travis and Peggy. And sure enough, the next day, the results came back and all three tested positive for this condition that the neurologist had guessed. And even though there was a cure for this condition, for Peggy, it was too late. Her body had been so completely ravaged that even if they administered the cure, it would not work fast enough to save her life. And so that day, the doctors went to Peggy, who despite being on all these painkillers is still squirming and writhing in pain and screaming into her pillow. They would tell her, "You're gonna die. The only thing we can do is try to make you as comfortable as possible and then try to save your boys." Not long after being told this terrible news, Peggy would slip into a coma, and then 4 months later, on March 3rd, 1989, Peggy's family had to make the heart-wrenching decision to pull her off life support. And then at that point, she passed away. As for her two boys, Dwayne would remain hospitalized for 2 months and would make a full recovery. As for Travis, he would remain hospitalized for 6 months, and while he would recover, he would never walk normally again. Even though the actual medical condition that killed Peggy and nearly killed Dwayne and Travis was completely known at this point. Everybody knew what it was. What nobody could figure out was why this happened. Why in the world did this happen to these people? It made no sense. However, shortly after Peggy's death, that mystery would actually begin to unravel in the most bizarre and totally roundabout way. There is an international organization called Mensa. That's not an acronym. It's a Latin word that roughly translates to table or mind. And this organization is a highly exclusive society for the ultra intelligent. You literally have to prove that your IQ, which is an intelligence test, ranks in the top 2% out of everybody in the entire world. And even then, you may not be smart enough to get in. And in the same town that Peggy and Pi had lived in Alturas, Florida, there was a chapter of Mensa. And the way some of these chapters worked is they would just get together every month and do some sort of intellectually stimulating activity. And in Alturas, that Mensa chapter, what they would do is they would get together at some private location once a month, and they would put on what they called a murder mystery weekend. The members of this chapter would head off to some private location like an inn or a hotel or a cabin or something, and they would all role play a murder investigation. So one or two of the Mensa members would come up with a very elaborate murder and subsequent investigation, and they would assign different fake characters to each of the real Mensa members. And so once they got there, they'd all find out what character they were and what they were responsible for. And then once they got into character, which included dressing up in costumes, they would remain in character until the killer was revealed. And so this activity was meant to be extremely intellectually challenging, but also it was extremely fun. The group loved these murder mystery weekends. And so with that in mind, just a couple of weeks after Peggy had passed away, so this is sometime in April of 1989, a new genius was accepted into the ranks of the Alturas Mensa chapter. Her name was Sherry Gwynn, and she was a middle-aged woman who had recently fled from Texas to Central Florida to get away from her abusive husband, who still lived in Texas. After she was accepted into the Mensa chapter, it became abundantly clear to the members that Sherry was eager to make friends. But not just any friends. She wanted to make friends with two very specific members of the Alturas Mensa chapter. And they were Diana Carr, who had no relationship to Pi Carr or his family, and Diana's husband, whose name was George Trapal. Diana was a very successful orthopedic surgeon who had her own practice in Alturas, Florida, and George was this computer programmer who had more advanced degrees than you could count. And, critically, Diana and George just so happened to live right next door to Peggy and Pi's house. Even though Sherry came on really strong right away to try to become friends with Diana and George, neither of them were fazed. The couple just figured, here's a woman who's living by herself, she's moved to a brand new area, she's run away from an abusive husband. It's no wonder she wants friends, and so she probably just needs some support. And so Diana and George were happy to just become her friend. The same month that Sherry was accepted into the Alturas Mensa chapter, George and Diana happened to be chosen as the people responsible for coming up with the complicated scenario that the group would act out during their murder mystery weekend that month. So George and Diana very diligently sat down and went over how to make the case as complicated as they could, and George took on the responsibility of really focusing on exactly how the victim in their fake scenario would be killed, because he was really trying to make it as difficult as he possibly could, and he was trying to find the perfect murder that would be nearly impossible to solve. And so he came up with this very elaborate murder scene, and then between him and what his wife was creating, they put together this really intense and very complicated scenario that they were both very happy about. And so a couple of days later, it was time to head out for the murder mystery weekend that George and Diana had worked so hard on. And so they went and printed off a whole bunch of those cards that would have all the information about who each of the Mensa members were going to be in this role-playing game. And there was some initial information about the murder that was committed, the so-called perfect crime that George had come up with. And so they printed all those cards out, they grabbed their costumes, they packed their stuff up, they hopped in the car, and they drove to the nearby inn where they met up with the rest of the Mensa members, which included Sherry. And so they get to this inn, everybody checks in, and then afterwards, they all meet up in the lobby where George and Diana hand out their cards that have the information about the role-playing game. And so everybody's reading it and figuring out what they're going to do with their character. And everyone's also looking at this so-called perfect crime that George had come up with, that he was also very proud about. And he was kind of boasting to the audience about how difficult this weekend was going to be. He really came up with the perfect crime. And so as all the members are reading their cards, Sherry would see the murder weapon used in this game, and she would become fascinated with it. And she would make a point of going over to George and asking him lots and lots of questions about how he came up with this particular choice of a murder weapon and what actually happens when this is used on a person, not just in the game, but in real life. It was like Sherry had become obsessed with this exact form of murder. She was so interested in it. And George, he was immediately aware that Sherry was kind of unnaturally interested in exactly how he had come up with the scheme. But in a way, it was kind of flattering for George because he had spent a lot of time constructing it to make it as complicated as he could. And so he indulged Sherry, and he sat there and told her everything about this particular weapon and what it does to the human body and, how you can get it and what the history of this weapon was. And the whole time, Sherry is just totally locked in. I mean, she's really focused on this particular style of murder. And so that murder mystery weekend would eventually come to an end, and all the Mensa members would think it was great, and they would head home. And then, over the course of nearly a year after that, Sherry would be a near constant in George and Diana's lives. I mean, she was always around them. She always wanted to meet up with them. She was always talking to them and asking them questions and calling. And anytime she was with them, she always wanted to be with George. And when she was with George, a lot of times she would bring up that very particular murder method that he had come up with for the murder mystery weekend. And George just continued to think this was just the greatest thing. It was so flattering that she thought he was so smart that he had come up with the perfect crime. And so anytime she wanted to talk about it, he would just indulge her because it made him feel really good. And if George and Diana had seen any red flags in Sherry with her behavior towards them, they certainly didn't show it. They basically were operating under the assumption that Sherry, no matter what, was just this helpless, harmless person who had come to Central Florida and she was trying to be their friend, and so they should try to be her friend back. But as they would soon find out, they were very, very wrong about Sherry. In December of 1989, so roughly 8 months after George and Diana had first met Sherry, Diana decided she wanted to move her medical practice from Alturas to a neighboring town called Sebring. And the drive from where their house was in Alturas to where her new office was going to be was just far enough that it made sense for George and Diana to relocate to Sebring. And when Sherry discovered that the couple was moving, she immediately called George and said, "Please, let me rent out your house. I don't have a place to stay. I've been staying with friends. I'll pay whatever rent you want." And as it happened, George and Diana had actually talked about keeping the house and renting it out. And so it was actually a pretty easy decision. They trusted Sherry, and so they said, you know what? That's fine. You can rent out the house for a couple of months, and then we'll decide if this is a long-term solution or not. And within just a couple of hours, Sherry was on Diana and George's doorstep with a sleeping bag and a small bag of toiletries ready to go inside. And so George and Diana, they grabbed the last couple of things they needed, and then as they walked out the front door, they gave their house key to Sherry and told her, hey, if you need anything, just give us a call. And then George and Diana, they climbed into their car, and as soon as they had drove off and were out of view, Sherry dropped her things, and she kind of looked around, and then she ran inside of the house. And just minutes later, practically the entire Alturas Police Department came crashing through that front door after Sherry. And within an hour, the police department would find something that would not only reveal the true identity of Sherry and her true intentions, but it would also reveal the truth about what happened to Peggy and her family. A couple of days before Peggy first started feeling bad, when her heart started racing and her arms and legs began tingling at the diner, a couple of days before that, someone had placed 8 Coca-Cola bottles, so full sodas, glass bottles, inside of Peggy and Pi's kitchen. And they set these 8 drinks kind of tucked away inside of a storage nook. A couple of days later, the family discovered these sodas, but they didn't think anything of it. They figured somebody else in the family had bought them and left them in the kitchen, and so they were fair game. And so before long, Peggy and the rest of her family were drinking these Cokes. But Peggy, who was notorious for loving Coca-Cola, drank way more than anybody else. Well, it would turn out all 8 of those Coca-Colas had been tampered with. They all contained a significant dose of the heavy metal called thallium. Thallium is odorless, it's colorless, it's tasteless, and even though there are very small trace amounts that naturally occur inside of our bodies, if there's even a little bit more than that inside of our bloodstream, it becomes lethal. And so when Peggy was admitted to the hospital the second time, around the same time that Dwayne and Travis were also admitted, that neurologist who was looking at Peggy, what he noticed about her condition was that her hair was starting to fall out. And that's when it clicked for him. He had this flashback to his medical training where he was taught about thallium poisoning. And one of the symptoms was hair loss. The other symptom was extreme pain in the extremities. And so the neurologist and his colleagues went and got a thallium test kit, and they tested Dwayne and Travis and Peggy, and they all came back positive for thallium poisoning, but the level of thallium inside of them was astronomical. The boys are lucky to have survived. They had 20,000 times the amount that naturally occurs inside of the human body. As for Peggy, she had an astounding 50,000 times the amount that naturally occurs. Way more than was lethal. And so that was why the doctors told her, there's nothing we can do. Your body is basically already dead. You're just technically still alive right now. And so the rest of the family, besides Dwayne and Travis, would also test for thallium, and they would all, with the exception of one child, have elevated levels of thallium. However, compared to Dwayne, Travis, and Peggy, of course, their conditions were negligible and they would all make full recoveries. And so the doctors realized fairly early on that this family has been poisoned, and so they contacted the police, who launched an investigation. And right away, their primary suspect was Pi. He and Peggy had been fighting extensively before she fell ill. He also had that kind of abrupt hunting trip that lined up with the day Peggy started feeling sick, and so they're thinking, okay, well, did that have something to do with how he planted the thallium? And then also there was the fact that Pi worked at the phosphate mining company and so had access to fairly rare chemicals. However, upon closer inspection, Pi did not have access to thallium specifically. Thallium is incredibly rare and very expensive. And it just seemed odd that he would use thallium to poison and kill his wife, but he would also poison himself and his son, who he adored. It just didn't really add up. And so Pi would get ruled out as a suspect fairly quickly. But during one of his last interrogations, he would give the police something he didn't think was very valuable, but it wound up being very significant. He would say that 3 months before Peggy got sick, their family received a death threat. He opened the mail one day and there was this typed out note that said, your family needs to leave Florida in the next 2 weeks or you're all going to die. But Pi thought it was some stupid teenage prank, and so he didn't think anything of it. And then when 2 weeks went by and they weren't dead, he just kind of forgot about it. And so after the police have ruled Pi out as a suspect, they didn't know where to turn. They had no other suspects. And so they just began focusing on who might have written this note. And that's where Sherry comes in. Sherry Gwynn was not a Texas transplant who had come to Central Florida to run away from her abusive husband. Sherry Gwynn wasn't even her real name. Her real name was Susan Gallek, and she had lived in Central Florida for most of her life. Susan was very smart, but she certainly was not Mensa-level genius smart. And so almost certainly her paperwork that got her in to the Alturas Mensa chapter was forged. Susan also had absolutely no interest in becoming real friends with Diana and George. The only reason she was pretending to be their friends and wanting to be around them all the time is because she was studying them. Because Susan was actually an undercover police officer. She had been sent undercover after the police discovered Diana and George were responsible for that death threat letter that was sent to Peggy and Pi. It would turn out Diana and George hated Peggy, Pi, and their kids. They hated them. They thought they were obnoxious. They were too noisy. They were annoying. And so Diana, who for context was the type of person who would stop people mid-sentence and correct them if they ever referred to her as anything other than Dr. Carr, she had gotten into at least 1 or 2 serious yelling fights with Peggy and with Pi and their kids when she had gone over to tell them to turn their music down and be quiet and do this and do that. And Peggy and Pi, they're not putting up with that. They just told her to get out of here. As for George, he didn't get into any public altercations with Peggy and Pi and their family. George was a very meek and submissive guy. He was very meager, and he was mostly a recluse. But he spent virtually all day peering out the window at Peggy and Pi and their family, studying what they were doing and obsessing over how noisy and obnoxious they were. And as he's seeing his wife getting more and more frustrated with their neighbors, George finally decides he's going to take drastic action. And so that's when George types out that death threat and he sends it across the way. But after Pi reads it, nothing happens. They don't leave Florida within 2 weeks. And so George went to phase 2 of his plan. George had actually spent time in a federal prison in the 1970s for cooking meth. And one of the byproducts of making meth is thallium. So George used his old meth cooking skills and he whipped up some thallium and he put lethal doses of thallium in 8 different Coca-Cola bottles. And then after mixing them all up so you couldn't tell there was any chemical inside of them, he used his bottle topping machine to put tops back on top of each of them. George made his own beer, and so that's why he had a topping machine at his house. And so with his 8 deadly drinks all prepared, looking like brand new Coca-Colas, George waited until Peggy and Pi and her family were out of their house, and then he snuck over and he walked into their kitchen and he placed these Coca-Colas right down on the kitchen counter and he slid them into a storage nook, and then he left the house, and that was it. And over the next several weeks, he watched with absolute pleasure as the family got sick and then Peggy died. While George never actually admitted that he had poisoned his neighbors, he did do some things that really tipped off Susan that he had to be the guy. Like, for example, that Mensa mystery murder weekend, the murder method that George had come up with was poisoning. And remember, at that point, Susan has been sent undercover to find out if George and Diana are responsible for poisoning their neighbors. And now George is sitting up there talking about the perfect crime he's come up with, and it's poisoning. And so that was why she had followed up with him really specifically on, wow, what else do you know about poisoning? And how'd you learn about poisoning? And what kind of poisons do you know about? And over the following months, even though Susan never got George to actually admit to her when she was undercover recording him that he was the poisoner, she did completely earn his trust. And she did this by always making sure she was very submissive around him and always made sure to stroke his ego and remind him how smart he was. I mean, George was used to being in a relationship with Diana, who was extremely overbearing and kind of kept him under her thumb. And so Susan kind of allowed George to feel like he was in control for once, and he loved it. And so he completely trusted Susan to the point where when he and Diana were going to move out of Alturas, they were willing to rent their house to Susan. And this is important because the house had not actually been emptied. A lot of their things were still in the house, including George's things. And so he just assumed Susan would never go through his things. But as soon as Susan was in that house and she watched George and Diana drive off, she immediately called in backup. The police swarmed the house, they searched it top to bottom, and in the garage they found George's chemistry equipment, and nestled underneath it was a bottle that contained thallium. George would be found guilty of first-degree murder as well as attempted murder on the rest of Peggy's family, and he would be sentenced to death. As of this episode, he is still alive and he is still on death row. As for his wife Diana, who many people believe must have had something to do with the poisoning, or must have at least known it was happening, was never actually charged with anything, and so she would eventually divorce George and move on with her life and remarry.
Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballin podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please ask the Amazon Music follow button to go out dancing with you. But when you get to the dance floor, repeatedly step on their feet without acknowledging it. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories we have posted on our main YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballin. We have a registered 501c3 charitable organization called the Mr. Ballin Foundation that honors and supports victims of violent crime as well as their families. Monthly donors to the Mr. Ballin Foundation Honor Them Society will receive free gifts and exclusive invites to special live events. Go to mrballin.foundation and click Get Involved to join the Honor Them Society today. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username is just @MrBallin, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. To check out our merch, join our official Mr. Ballin Discord server, or just see what events are coming up in your area, head on over to ballinstudios.com. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya.